For most contemporaries, the war that began in 1914 did not come as a surprise. International politics in Europe had been far too tense and conflict-ridden in the preceding years. The system of powers had tolerated the German nation-state only as long as it was willing to impose strict limitations on itself. However, between 1871 and 1914, Germany increased its industrial production sixfold, surpassing Great Britain. As a booming economic power, Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm II had, since the beginning of the 20th century, sought to play an active and shaping political role both within and outside Europe. This inevitably provoked resistance and conflicts with other European powers, as they perceived the globally ambitious German Empire as a dangerous disruptor of their own imperial goals. The prevailing sentiment among nearly all Germans was that Germany was encircled by envious nations that begrudged its rise. Increasing nationalism and the general pursuit of power began to tear apart the finely woven network of diplomatic agreements that had prevented wars for decades. While the Moroccan crisis between Germany and France in 1911 could still be resolved peacefully, Italy's attack on the Ottoman Empire in present-day Libya in late September 1911 marked the first direct confrontation between two major European powers in 40 years. Following Italy's example, Serbia, Montenegro, Bulgaria, and Greece violently seized territories from the weakening Ottoman Empire during the First Balkan War of 1912. Europe would not find peace again for many years to come, well beyond 1918. Although the European great powers refrained from direct military involvement in the Balkan conflicts, they all intensified their efforts in an escalating arms race amid recurring crises over spheres of influence and markets. In Germany, the Reichstag approved in 1913 an increase in the army's strength by 136,000 to over 800,000 men. At the same time, the army was granted generous financial resources for modernization. By late 1912, many high-ranking German military officials had already become convinced of the inevitability of a Europe-wide war. And the situation was not much different in other states. The immediate path to war followed the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914. The assassination first triggered diplomatic, then military actions that increasingly pushed the heavily armed states toward confrontation. During the July crisis, all diplomatic efforts to find a peaceful solution failed. No monarch or senior politician in Europe had planned a major war in the long term. But by July 1914, none categorically ruled it out either. The mutual distrust between the two opposing blocs of great powers had grown too strong. The desire to demonstrate strength and to exploit the tense situation for one's own advantage was too great, and the willingness to accept a loss of prestige to preserve peace was too small. In the German Empire, military logic heavily influenced political decision-making. The imperial government sought to keep the conflict between its ally Austria-Hungary and Serbia localized. At the same time, it wanted to test Russia's readiness for war as Serbia's ally. Berlin considered the moment for a war against Russia the least unfavorable, fearing that the rapidly rearming Tsarist Empire would soon be able to overwhelm Germany simply by the sheer number of its soldiers. Alarmed by Russia's armament efforts and possible westward expansionism, Germany preferred to go to war in 1914 rather than a few years later, when the chances of victory would have diminished dramatically. This strengthened the determination of the German government to escape forward and to support Austria-Hungary under all circumstances. Otherwise, it feared that the largely isolated German Empire would lose its last loyal ally. After Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914, all alliance agreements were triggered within a few days. In grim anticipation of the unpredictable consequences of the war now breaking out across much of Europe and beyond, Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg spoke of an uncertain leap into the dark: the assassination of Sarajevo. The local event reported by the Bosnische Post on June 28, 1914, was to have worldwide consequences. In special editions, the largest German-language daily newspaper in Sarajevo, founded in 1884, reported on the attacks against the Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne and his wife. The assassinations triggered an international crisis that led to war within 6 weeks. Archduke Franz Ferdinand visited Sarajevo on Sunday, June 28, 1914, with his wife Sophie to inspect a military exercise of the Austro-Hungarian armed forces. Since 1878, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy had administered Bosnia and Herzegovina. The formal annexation of these provinces in 1908 had intensified conflicts with the neighboring Kingdom of Serbia, which also claimed these territories, where a significant Serbian minority lived. The visit of the Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne to the provincial capital was therefore also a demonstration of political power. Although there had already been several attacks against representatives of the administration in the region, the press published the date and schedule of the visit in advance. The Assassins, a group of young men fighting for the unification of all South Slavs into a single state under Serbian leadership, were thus able to plan their actions precisely. With their deed, they wanted to make a statement against the Austro-Hungarian occupation. The first assassination attempt, however, failed. The bomb thrown by one of the conspirators at the Archduke's motorcade injured several bystanders and members of Franz Ferdinand's entourage, including his adjutant, Lieutenant Colonel Erich von Maritzi. Under the headline, Jezerke, the first assassination, an unnamed reporter for the Bosnische Post described the incident. After a short interruption, the uninjured heir to the throne and his wife continued their official program, which gave the conspirators a second opportunity to strike. From the crowd, Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb, fired a revolver at the open limousine in which Franz Ferdinand and his wife were driving through the city. Both died shortly afterward from their severe injuries. The Bosnian Post was among the first newspapers to report the death of the heir to the throne and his wife. Just a few hours after the attack, which occurred shortly after 11 a.m., the newspaper's second special edition described the dramatic events, of which no photographs have survived. However, the report contained several errors. For instance, it claimed that Princip, referred to as a certain Frick from Grahovo, had thrown a bomb, which he did not. A more detailed account of the events and the first reactions appeared in the Bosnische Post's third special edition, published on the evening of June 28th. The murders outraged the public. The angry crowd at the scene had to be prevented with difficulty from lynching Princip. Riots and assaults against Serbs broke out in Sarajevo the same day. The police investigations, launched immediately, revealed that the Serbian Secret Service had supported the conspirators with weapons, money, and information. Politicians and military leaders in Austria-Hungary wanted to use the situation to politically humiliate Serbia, which had strengthened its position in the region after the Balkan Wars. The Austro-Hungarian monarchy received explicit support for military action from the German Empire, thereby intensifying the tensions among the European great powers that became known as the July Crisis. Princip and 24 co-conspirators were put on trial before an Austro-Hungarian court beginning in October 1914. He and several others were convicted of high treason and murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Princip died in April 1918 in the fortress of Theresienstadt as a result of the harsh prison conditions. Yugoslavia, which emerged as a state after World War I, honored him with monuments. For many Serbs, Princip is still regarded today as a freedom fighter and national hero. The July Crisis of 1914. In the afternoon of August 1, 1914, thousands of people gathered in front of the Berlin Palace to witness the outcome of a German ultimatum to Russia. Since mid-July 1914, tension had been rising not only in the political power center of Berlin, but throughout Germany and Europe, as people wondered whether the political crisis would escalate into a military conflict. When, around 5 p.m. on the first day of August, Germany finally announced mobilization and soon after declared war on Russia, the tense uncertainty of the preceding weeks gave way to clarity. The war that had loomed since the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, was about to begin. The assassination of the Austro-Hungarian heir and his wife had caused international shock. As there was credible evidence of the Serbian Secret Service's involvement in the plot, politicians and military leaders of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy pressed for a military strike against the neighboring state. To that end, they secured the support of the German Empire. In early July 1914, Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg and Kaiser Wilhelm II assured the Austro-Hungarian envoy that Germany would stand by its ally in a war against Serbia. Germany did not want to lose the dual monarchy as its last remaining ally. However, the calculations of the German General Staff and government went far beyond the Balkan conflict. The war between Serbia and Austria-Hungary was to serve as a test case for the international alliance system. Would the small Balkan state receive military aid from its protector Russia? And would the great powers allied with Russia, France, and Great Britain also intervene? Diplomats in all countries understood the danger that the alliance system posed, turning a local conflict into a European one. In close coordination with its German ally, the dual monarchy issued a 2-day ultimatum to Serbia on July 23rd, the demands of which were deliberately unacceptable. Austria-Hungary required not only the extradition of all those who had supported the assassination of the heir to the throne, but also the right to conduct investigations within Serbia. This intrusion into national sovereignty was unacceptable to Serbia. After Austria-Hungary rejected further mediation attempts by the other great powers, it declared war on Serbia on July 28th. Russia then mobilized its army against Austria-Hungary on July 29th, to which the latter responded with a general mobilization on July 31st. Parallel to the mobilizations, frantic diplomatic efforts were made to prevent further escalation. None of the powers involved in the looming European war wanted to appear as the aggressor. At the same time, each sought to demonstrate its strength. Every state feared a loss of prestige through excessive conciliation. No government knew what the potential adversary's next move would be, and so every country wanted to be prepared for all eventualities to avoid strategic disadvantages in case of a delayed mobilization of its own forces. Especially in the German Empire, supposed military necessities strongly influenced political decisions. On July 31st, Germany declared a state of imminent war danger and demanded that Russia halt the mobilization of its army within 12 hours. When this did not happen, Germany declared war on the Tsarist Empire the following day. This made the expansion of the conflict inevitable, as France had already signaled its intention to fulfill its alliance obligations toward Russia. The plan developed by the German General Staff for a two-front war called for a rapid deployment of troops in the West. Consequently, on August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. The strategic and operational directives of the German forces involved an advance through Belgium into France. The invasion of neutral Belgium prompted Great Britain to declare war on Germany on August 4th, siding with France and Russia. Across Europe, people followed in suspense as the looming conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia expanded within days into a full-scale European war. Special editions of newspapers and official announcements reported on the dramatic developments. Due to prevailing nationalism in all states and effective government propaganda, most people believed that the war had been forced upon them by enemy nations. Thus, young men eagerly obeyed the mobilization orders proclaimed on public walls and in extra editions of newspapers. Declarations of war. At the beginning of the First World War, the Central Powers, the German Empire and Austria-Hungary, stood on one side, while the Entente powers, Great Britain, France, and Russia, stood on the other. Belgium, Serbia, and Montenegro joined the Entente, while the Ottoman Empire entered into an alliance with the Central Powers. In 1915, Bulgaria also joined the Central Powers. Over the course of the war, numerous other countries sided with the Entente. Among the most significant were Italy, Romania, and the United States. Japan also declared war on the German Empire and occupied its colonies in China and the Pacific. The Latin American countries and China, which also joined the Entente, played only a minor role in the war since they did not send troops. Altogether, 38 states participated in the conflict, and with their colonies included, 2/3 of the world's population was affected by the war. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914, marking the official beginning of the conflict, and later on August 6, 1914, declared war on Russia. The German Empire followed soon after, declaring war on Russia on August 1, 1914, on Luxembourg on August 2, on France on August 3, and on Belgium on August 4, 1914. Further declarations came against Portugal on March 9, 1916, and Romania on August 27, 1916. Great Britain declared war on the German Empire on August 4, 1914, on Austria-Hungary on August 12, 1914, on the Ottoman Empire on November 5, 1914, and on Bulgaria on October 15, 1915. Serbia declared war on the German Empire on August 6, 1914, and on the Ottoman Empire on November 7, 1914. Montenegro followed, declaring war on Austria-Hungary on August 7, 1914, and on the German Empire. On August 11, 1914, France entered the conflict against Austria-Hungary on August 13, 1914, later declaring war on the Ottoman Empire on November 6, 1914, and on Bulgaria on October 16, 1915. Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire on November 2, 1914, and on Bulgaria on October 20, 1915. Japan, pursuing its imperial interests in East Asia, declared war on the German Empire on August 23, 1914, seizing its colonial possessions in China and the Pacific. Italy, initially neutral despite being a member of the Triple Alliance, switched sides and declared war on Austria-Hungary on May 23, 1915, later on the Ottoman Empire on August 20, 1915, on Bulgaria on October 19, 1915, and finally on the German Empire on August 28, 1916. Bulgaria, having joined the Central Powers, declared war on Serbia on October 12, 1915, and on Romania on September 1, 1916. Romania, in turn, declared war on Austria-Hungary on August 27, 1916, while the Ottoman Empire declared war on Romania. On August 30, 1916, Greece entered the war on the side of the Entente on November 25, 1916, declaring war on both the German Empire and Bulgaria on the same day. The United States, after maintaining neutrality for much of the conflict, declared war on the German Empire on April 6, 1917, and on Austria-Hungary on December 7, 1917. By the end of 1917, the world was engulfed in a truly global conflict, fought not only on the battlefields of Europe but also in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The First World War had expanded far beyond its origins in the Balkans, drawing in nations across every continent and reshaping the course of modern history. The Entente, also known as the Triple Entente, was a formal alliance between France, Great Britain, and Russia. From the beginning of the war, Serbia and Belgium fought alongside the Entente powers. Later, several other nations joined the alliance. The entry of Italy and Romania into the war created serious problems for the Central Powers, particularly in the Balkans and along Austria's southern border. On the Western Front, increasing numbers of soldiers from the Commonwealth countries were deployed. The Supreme Army Command, OHL, completely underestimated the military potential of the United States. After the U.S. declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917, and a few months later on Austria-Hungary, the military collapse of the Central Powers became only a matter of time. Even at the outbreak of the war, the Entente states, with a population of about 262 million and 5.7 million soldiers, were far superior to the Central Powers. Russia, with its 173 million people, had an almost inexhaustible supply of manpower and, due to its vast geography, was militarily nearly impossible to defeat. Britain, protected by its powerful navy, was safe from invasion. However, to secure supply routes across the English Channel to the battlefields in Belgium and France, the Entente first had to prevent the occupation of the Channel ports. Britain and France also deployed strong forces in the Balkans and in the fight for the Dardanelles. While unrestricted submarine warfare inflicted heavy losses on the Entente powers, it was not decisive for the outcome of the war. In contrast, the British naval blockade of Germany led to severe food shortages and major supply problems with raw materials. At the beginning of the war, the Central Powers had around 3.8 million soldiers, facing 5.7 million on the Entente side. During the course of the war, the Central Powers increased their troop numbers to over 22 million. With a total population of about 118 million, the German Empire and Austria-Hungary together had less than half the population of their opponents. Moreover, within Austria-Hungary's 51 million inhabitants, there were significant ethnic tensions. To achieve military success against the numerically superior Entente, a quick victory on one of the two fronts was essential. With the failure of the Schlieffen Plan, the Central Powers found themselves in a precarious position. They depended on imports of food and raw materials from neutral countries, and since no preparations had been made for a long war, the British naval blockade quickly caused severe shortages of food and munitions supplies. In October 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of the Central Powers and closed the Dardanelles Strait. At the same time, the German Navy blocked access to the Baltic Sea, making it almost impossible for Britain and France to send supplies to Russia. After the German summer offensive of 1915, Bulgaria joined the Central Powers. With the help of Bulgarian troops, the front in the Balkans was stabilized. However, the Central Powers lacked a military strategy for defeating the Entente in the Balkans and likewise had no strategic concept for victory over Russia. Given the superiority of the British fleet, Germany's overseas colonies were also militarily indefensible. Before the war, the German government under Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg had been reluctant to form an alliance with the Ottoman Empire. For Russia, control of the Bosporus was one of its main war aims, as it sought free passage for its ships from the Black Sea into the Aegean. The Entente supported this demand at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. Accordingly, the Turkish Sultan Mehmed V, 1844 to 1918, sought alignment with the Central Powers. On August 2, 1914, a defensive alliance was signed, closing the Bosporus to the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The Ottoman Empire opened its ports to German warships, but initially did not take direct part in the fighting. The mining of the Black Sea by Russia escalated the situation. On October 31, 1914, the German warships Breslau and Goeben, sailing under the Ottoman flag from Turkish ports, bombarded the Russian city of Odessa. 2 days later, the Allies declared war on the Ottoman Empire. As a result, the campaign against Serbia became crucial for the Central Powers in order to secure a supply route to Turkey. The alliance with Bulgaria, concluded in September 1915, primarily served this purpose. The Schlieffen Plan. Alfred Graf von Schlieffen, born in 1833, served as chief of the General Staff of the German Army from 1891 to 1905. Shortly before his retirement, he drafted a memorandum outlining a German strategy for a two-front war against Russia and France. During the time required for Russia to complete its mobilization, France was to be defeated first, after which German troops would be transferred from the Western Front to the Eastern Front. This so-called Schlieffen Plan developed into a military doctrine before 1914 and was later revised by Schlieffen's successor, Helmut Graf von Moltke. The plan envisioned two German armies encircling France from the north and the south. The pincer was to close west of Paris, forcing the enemy to surrender. However, the plan required German troops to march through neutral Belgium. Because Great Britain was the guarantor of Belgian neutrality, Germany's invasion on August 3rd to 4th, 1914, led directly to Britain's declaration of war. The implementation of the Schlieffen Plan ultimately failed. Moltke prematurely halted the Battle of the Marne in September 1914. At the same time, Russian troops had already invaded East Prussia in August and defeated the German army in the Battle of Gumbinnen. The Supreme Army Command, OHL, the Supreme Command of the German army formerly lay with the Kaiser. Only he, as the supreme warlord, held authority over the army's high command. Wilhelm II resided at the Great Headquarters during the war. Weakened by depression and illness, however, he gradually withdrew from active participation in military decision-making. The actual direction of military operations rested with the Chief of the General Staff. At the beginning of the war, this was Helmut von Moltke. After the failed offensive at the Marne, Moltke was forced to resign in the autumn of 1914. His successor, Erich von Falkenhayn, failed with his concept of a war of attrition at Verdun. When the Third Supreme Army Command, OOHL, was established in the summer of 1916, the German public placed great hopes in it. Its leader became the celebrated hero of Tannenberg, General Paul von Hindenburg, who had been recalled to service at the start of the war. His chief of staff was General Erich Ludendorff, who, together with Hindenburg, had achieved impressive victories over two Russian armies at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes in 1914. Ludendorff, in particular, demanded that the OHL also take control of domestic and foreign policy. He played a role in the dismissal of Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg and provoked the United States' entry into the war by pushing for the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare. As Ludendorff and Hindenburg's influence grew, Kaiser Wilhelm II increasingly faded into the background. Trench warfare, after the disastrous failure of the Marne offensive and the German retreat behind the Eisenach River, opposing armies along the Western Front faced each other from autumn 1914 onward, from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border. Hastily dug earth holes were meant to protect soldiers from enemy fire. In what became known as trench warfare, both sides eventually constructed a complex, often three-tiered system of deep trenches stretching along the 700-kilometer front. These trenches, equipped with bunkers and dugouts, were connected by communication lines linking the front to supply depots and field hospitals. Entire forests were cut down to fortify the trenches. The machine gun soon became the symbol of this deadly form of warfare. Heavy machine guns and barbed wire entanglements were designed to prevent enemy assaults and make territorial gains nearly impossible. In response, long artillery bombardments, drumfire, were used to wear down the enemy and destroy their fortifications before launching an assault. During these offensives, advancing troops were preceded by a creeping barrage of artillery fire intended to shield them. However, the bombardment often fell short, killing the attackers' own men. Despite the inferno, enough defenders usually survived to maintain resistance. For the attackers, assaults on fortified positions were far more costly. Hundreds died in the machine gun fire. Even when attackers managed to gain a few hundred meters, the newly captured trench was often retaken within hours or days by enemy counterattacks. Without an agreed truce, wounded soldiers stranded in no man's land between the trenches often succumbed to their injuries after long, agonizing hours, their cries for help unheard. Attempts to return to war of movement through massive battles of materiel led to previously unimaginable numbers of casualties. On the German side, losses soon could no longer be replaced with fresh troops. Even major offensives involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers failed to achieve decisive breakthroughs in enemy lines. From 1915 onward, poison gas was introduced, and from 1916, tanks were deployed in hopes of regaining mobility. But by the spring of 1918, the Western Front had barely shifted. In many places, opposing trenches lay less than 100 meters apart. Life in these dugouts defined the daily existence of the front soldiers. The cramped quarters, constant mud and filth, lack of privacy even for basic needs, catastrophic hygiene, infestations of rats and lice, the persistent stench, exhaustion from lack of sleep, and the constant fear of the next attack wore down even the most seasoned fighters. With death as a constant companion, many soldiers were unable to bear the physical and psychological strain of trench warfare. After 1918, nearly every German town had men suffering from tremors or severe psychological trauma, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. When children asked about them, people would often simply say, "Oh, he was in the war." Battles of attrition. The first months of the First World War made it clear that the fighting would not be of short duration. On the Western Front, both sides dug deeply layered trench systems, which forced a technological modernization of warfare in an effort to weaken the enemy and eventually break through the heavily fortified defensive lines. From 1915 onward, new types of weaponry defined the unprecedented battles of attrition. Especially in the West, mass killing began with heavy artillery that subjected enemy positions to hours or even days of continuous bombardment to make them ready for assault. In the German army, the steel helmet gradually replaced the spiked helmet, Pickelhaube, from 1916 onward, as the latter provided too little protection. Soldiers, too, came to be regarded as expendable material, just like guns and ammunition. They were expected to risk their lives daily. Death was glorified as a hero's death for the fatherland, meant to strip it of its individual horror. The concept of the Battle of Attrition reached a tragic climax in 1916, with the fighting around the fortress of Verdun and along the Somme, and again in 1917 in Flanders. At the start of the war in 1914, the German field army possessed about 6,300 light and nearly 1,150 heavy guns. By early 1917, that number had risen to roughly 12,500 light and 7,200 heavy guns. The entire industrial production of the warring nations was geared toward the mass manufacture of ammunition, which increased year by year. The French and British alone fired about half of all their shells used during the entire war in 1918. In total, the artillery of the Entente and the Central Powers fired more than 850 million rounds. About half of all soldiers killed in the First World War died as a result of artillery fire. The massive use of long-range cannons and the destructive power of shells, mines, and bombs left the battlefields covered in trenches, shell craters, and swamp-like terrain littered with dead tree stumps and ruins of villages. In the combat zones of northern France, Belgium, and western Russia, hundreds of thousands of houses as well as bridges were destroyed. Roads and railway lines were largely damaged. Villages, towns, and entire landscapes along the front were rendered completely unrecognizable and uninhabitable. These immense destructions stood in stark contrast to the minimal territorial gains achieved, gains that were usually lost again after only a short time. On the front lines, machine guns, flamethrowers, and hand grenades were among the most effective infantry weapons. Hundreds of thousands of hand grenades detonated daily during offensives on the Western Front, with Germany producing up to 9 million per month. Traditional leather helmets could no longer protect soldiers from shrapnel. The steel helmet, introduced in 1916, offered better protection against shell fragments, which caused mass death and mutilation. Other protective gear such as body armor and face masks were also developed to safeguard soldiers from these deadly effects. Tanks. The illustration of a miniature tin model represents one of the new weapons of the First World War, the tank. On February 20th, 1915, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, founded the Land Ships Committee. The goal of this committee, composed of naval officers and engineers, and politicians, was to develop an armored, all-terrain vehicle capable of crossing areas under heavy fire and destroying fortified enemy positions. The British military leadership hoped this invention would restore movement to the war, which had become bogged down in static trench warfare. The project was kept under strict secrecy. To disguise its purpose, it was said that the committee was producing water containers, or tanks. The term later became the common word for these vehicles. The first tank was the Mark I, a diamond-shaped tracked vehicle measuring 2.4 meters in height, 4.2 meters in width, and 8 meters in length, weighing 28 tons. It came in two complementary versions. The male model, armed with 2 cannons and 3 machine guns, was designed to destroy enemy fortifications. The female model, equipped with 5 machine guns, supported these assaults and defended against enemy infantry attacks. The tank's top speed was 6 kilometers per hour, allowing only very slow movement on the battlefield. The crew consisted of 8 men, equipped with special helmets designed to protect their faces and eyes from shrapnel. The new weapon saw its first use on the morning of September 15, 1916, when 49 British tanks attacked German positions near Flers-Courcelette. However, 17 broke down en route due to mechanical and technical failures. The remaining tanks did break through enemy lines but were too few in number to achieve a decisive victory. More significant than the military success was the psychological shock their appearance caused among German troops. The first large-scale use of tanks occurred in November 1917 Beaune. During the Battle of Cambrai, when around 460 Mark IV tanks, a new and improved model, advanced on German trenches. Yet even this offensive failed to produce the hoped-for breakthrough. Around 1,200 Mark IV tanks were produced during the war, followed in 1918 by the technologically improved Mark V. In France, tank development had begun in mid-1916, while in Germany it started later that year. However, Germany produced only 20 tanks of its own model, the Sturmpanzerwagen A7 The world's first tank battle took place on April 24, 1918, near Villers-Bretonneux, between 3 British Mark IVs and 3 German A7 Fies. During the engagement, 2 British tanks and 1 German tank were damaged and disabled. Although German infantry managed to capture the contested town, it was soon recaptured by Australian troops. After the end of the First World War, only a few of the thousands of tanks produced in Britain and France remained in use for a few more years. Most were quickly scrapped to recover valuable raw materials. From a technical development standpoint, neither the British nor the German designs proved decisive for the future. Instead, it was a French model that set the standard. The Renault CFT, the first tank to feature a fully rotating turret, which became the blueprint for future tank design. A few First World War tanks that were kept as souvenirs or trophies have survived and are preserved in museums today. These include the only remaining Mark I at the Tank Museum in Bovington, England, which also houses several other models of the Mark series. The Imperial War Museum in London displays a Mark V, while the Musée de l'Armée in Paris exhibits a Renault FT. A replica of the A7 Vive can be seen at the German Tank Museum in Munster, Lower Saxony, and the last original A7 Vive is on display at the Queensland Museum in Australia. Aerial warfare. At the beginning of the 20th century, aviation underwent rapid technological development. Every innovation, every new invention, every groundbreaking aircraft type was celebrated enthusiastically by a technology-obsessed public throughout Europe and North America. Less than 2 decades separated the first powered flight of just a few seconds in 1903 from the first 16-hour transatlantic flight in 1919. The First World War dramatically accelerated this process. At the outbreak of the war, airplanes were primarily used for reconnaissance by military leaders. The idea of employing them as offensive weapons had not yet taken shape. Crews were equipped with small bombs, weighing only 5 to 10 kilograms, which they dropped by hand without any targeting devices, producing minimal effect. The airship, rather than the airplane, was considered the more suitable vehicle for bombing missions during the first half of the war. Airships were equipped with simple aiming devices that gradually improved the accuracy of bomb drops. When the war began, the notion of aerial combat was still far off. Many pilots knew one another from international aviation events and were often more fascinated by each other's aircraft than by the idea of shooting one another down. The first air battles were improvised with pistols. Only when engineers managed to synchronize machine guns to fire through the arc of a spinning propeller did the true era of the fighter plane begin. Aircraft capable of shooting down balloons, zeppelins, reconnaissance, and bomber planes and even engaging in dogfights with other fighters. For a long time, German fighter pilots were technically and tactically superior to their Allied counterparts. They had more advanced aircraft and were better organized. German aircraft production was closely associated with the Dutch designer Anton Fokker, who worked for the German arms industry. From 1916 onward, both sides moved from individual sorties to organized group formations, creating permanent fighter squadrons. Successful pilots became celebrated war heroes. Germany's most famous flying aces included Oswald Bohlke, 1891 to 1916, Max Immelmann, Ernst Udet, and above all, Manfred Freiherr von Richthofen, known worldwide as the Red Baron. By the summer of 1917, however, the Allies had achieved air superiority due to their numerical advantage. Airplanes increasingly took part directly in ground battles to support infantry by strafing enemy trenches or preventing artillery crews from firing. By 1917, both British and German forces were capable of launching long-range strategic bombing missions. German bombers repeatedly attacked British cities, killing many civilians and disrupting industrial production. The German military leadership placed great hopes in Zeppelins, which were used primarily against England as a countermeasure to the British blockade. Until the spring of 1917, the German Army and Navy jointly bombed areas in and around London, as well as targets in central England and Scotland. Residential areas were not specifically targeted, though they were often hit. More than 500 people were killed in these raids. Bombing royal family estates and palaces was initially forbidden by direct order of the Kaiser. The main military impact of these attacks lay not in destruction, but in forcing Britain to divert defense resources away from the front and in halting war production during repeated air raid alarms. For the first time, large portions of the civilian population directly experienced warfare, a grim preview of what would later occur on a far greater scale during the Second World War. For the first time, death and destruction descended from the sky, far from the front lines. It was only in the final year of the war that improved British fighter defenses managed to repel the Zeppelin attacks and force Germany to abandon its airship campaign altogether. In 1914, the German air service consisted of around 4,000 men and 300 aircraft. By 1918, it had grown to approximately 80,000 men and 5,000 planes. Around 12,000 airmen were killed or wounded. A total of 4,578 pilots and 299 ground crew members were killed in action, along with nearly 2,000 others who died in accidents and test flights at home. By the end of the First World War, all major military aircraft types had been tested: fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, infantry support aircraft, and transport planes. Tactical and strategic doctrines for air warfare had also begun to develop. Nevertheless, air power remained of relatively limited significance to the overall conduct of the war by 1918. It was only at the beginning of the Second World War that the full destructive potential of air forces, their devastating effect on civilian populations, and their decisive role in modern warfare would truly become evident. The Red Baron. Manfred Freiherr von Richthofen, known as the Red Baron, was the most successful fighter pilot of the First World War, credited with 80 confirmed aerial victories. The nickname derived from both the bright red paint on his aircraft and his noble title. At the beginning of the war, Richthofen served on the Eastern Front. After a brief deployment on the Western Front, he requested a transfer to the air service. Initially assigned as a reconnaissance observer in a bomber unit, he completed his pilot training by Christmas 1915. By that time, the role of aircraft was shifting from reconnaissance to direct combat. On September 1, 1916, Baron von Richthofen began flying the new single-seat fighter, the Fokker D-1. He scored his first aerial victory on September 17th. Awarded the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor, he received command of a fighter squadron in January 1917 and, by July, was promoted to commander of Fighter Wing 1, which consisted of 48 aircraft. On April 21, 1918, while pursuing an enemy pilot at low altitude behind British lines, Richthofen was fatally shot through the heart. Respected even by his enemies as a flying ace, the Red Baron was buried by the British with full military honors. Naval warfare. At the turn of the 20th century, naval power was regarded by all imperial nations as a key prerequisite for asserting their global influence. Warships were indispensable instruments of foreign policy. From the so-called gunboat diplomacy emerged a naval arms race. Naval rivalry and maritime rearmament were among the factors that heightened international tensions before 1914. For a century, the British Royal Navy had been the undisputed ruler of the seas. However, the United States and especially Germany had entered the global naval arms race. Beginning in 1897, German Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz spearheaded the construction of a modern battle fleet aimed at rivaling Britain's maritime dominance. The goal was to make the German Navy so strong that any British attack would pose an incalculable risk. During the war, however, the heavily armed German High Seas Fleet failed to meet expectations. Its operations were limited to the North and Baltic Seas, as the German Admiralty believed that Britain would seek a decisive naval battle in the German Bight. But the British avoided such a confrontation and instead focused on maintaining a large-scale distant blockade across the North Sea. This blockade effectively cut Germany off from global trade and gradually crippled its economy. Only once did the two great fleets meet in a major engagement, on May 31, 1916, at the Battle of Jutland, Skagerrak, between Denmark and Norway. The numerically inferior Imperial German Navy achieved a tactical success, demonstrating superiority in ship design and crew training. Strategically, however, the Royal Navy's blockade remained unchallenged. Allied supply lines were only temporarily disrupted by attacks from German raiders and auxiliary cruisers operating overseas. Germany and its allies managed to maintain control of the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and the Adriatic, while the Allies dominated all other oceans. The German military leadership soon pinned its hopes on a new weapon, the submarine, which added a new dimension to warfare, the depths of the sea. On September 22, 1914, the German submarine U-9, commanded by Lieutenant Otto Weddigen, sank 3 British cruisers in the North Sea in a single strike. Overnight, the submarine became a formidable weapon capable of challenging British naval supremacy from beneath the surface. However, Germany's limited number of submarines and their long approach routes made it difficult to threaten Allied shipping effectively. In the end, the submarine campaign and the diplomatic controversy surrounding it caused severe political damage, alienating many neutral nations. The unrestricted submarine warfare launched by Germany contributed directly to the entry of the United States into the war in 1917, a decision that significantly influenced the outcome of the conflict to Germany's disadvantage. The naval blockade. The main task of the British home fleet during the war, in addition to securing its own sea routes and preventing German invasion attempts, was the establishment of a naval blockade aimed at cutting off supplies to the import-dependent economies of the Central Powers. Immediately after the outbreak of war, Britain imposed a trade embargo against Germany. To enforce it, a distant blockade was established near British naval bases, stretching from the Shetland Islands to southern Norway and across the English Channel near Dover, secured by minefields and patrol ships. The German Naval Command under Alfred von Tirpitz had expected a close blockade of German ports, against which the High Seas Fleet was intended to break through. However, an attack on the distant blockade was considered far too risky, so German ships remained in Entente, a defensive posture, and made no attempt to break it. Nevertheless, in 1914, substantial shipments of raw materials still reached the German Empire. In response, Britain tightened its blockade regulations and continuously expanded the list of goods subject to confiscation from neutral vessels. On November 2, 1914, the British Admiralty declared the entire North Sea a war zone and established specific routes for neutral shipping, forcing them into British-controlled ports for inspection. Through a combination of military and diplomatic pressure, most neutral nations were compelled to accept British control over maritime trade. Although these measures violated international law, Britain largely avoided open protest through numerous agreements with neutral states. While supplies to the Central Powers could never be completely stopped, the naval blockade proved highly effective, leading to severe shortages of raw materials and food in Germany. With no realistic prospect of breaking the blockade through open naval combat, the German Admiralty soon demanded the introduction of unrestricted submarine warfare. Economic warfare was thus deliberately directed by both sides against civilian populations in an effort to force a military victory. Overall, the British naval blockade proved to be a highly effective and enduring weapon against the German economy and the suffering civilian population. So much so that it became known in Germany as the Hunger Blockade. Even after the Armistice of Compiègne in November 1918, the British continued the blockade, further deepening resentment and bitterness within Germany. The Submarine War. Submarines are inventions of the 19th century. As early as 1850, navies around the world began to explore their potential military use, though Germany only showed serious interest at the beginning of the 20th century. Naval authorities long believed in the superiority of surface battle fleets, composed of heavy battleships and fast cruisers. Submarines were seen as playing only a minor role in commerce raiding and reconnaissance. Consequently, German submarines were not given names but numbers. The first, U-1, entered service in 1906. According to international law, submarines were treated like cruisers. They were not allowed to sink enemy merchant ships without first stopping, searching, and, if necessary, seizing or sinking them according to prize regulations after ensuring the crew's safety. Their technical design reflected this role. They were powered by diesel or petroleum engines on the surface and by weaker electric motors underwater. In reality, these were submersible boats rather than true submarines. They fought primarily above the surface. However, unarmored submarines were highly vulnerable in surface combat and lost their element of surprise. Their main weapons were deck guns, which could be used to fire warning shots across the bow, Schuss, Vord and Bug, to stop merchant ships, as required by maritime law. Torpedoes, on the other hand, were reserved for surprise attacks on warships. On September 22, 1914, the German submarine U-9, commanded by Lieutenant Otto Weddigen, sank 3 British cruisers in the North Sea in a single attack. Overnight, the submarine became a serious weapon, one that seemed capable of challenging British naval supremacy from the depths. The German public was thrilled by the success of this new weapon. Numerous propaganda-driven fundraising campaigns were launched to finance the expansion of the submarine fleet. Among others, the renowned marine painter Willy Stuver designed posters such as this 1917 depiction, showing a tiny submarine braving wind and waves alone against the enemy. On November 2, 1914, Britain declared the North Sea a war zone and began a blockade that cut Germany off from world trade. In response, the German Empire declared the waters around Great Britain a war zone, and on February 22, 1915, ordered submarine warfare against Allied and neutral merchant ships in these areas according to prize regulations. In exceptional cases, submarines fired without warning, even without a prior shot across the bow. When in May 1915, the British passenger liner Lusitania, which was mistakenly believed to be carrying weapons as an auxiliary cruiser, was sunk and over 100 American citizens were killed, the neutral United States protested and threatened to enter the war. The submarine campaign began to damage Germany's diplomatic standing. Kaiser Wilhelm II immediately ordered that neutral ships and enemy passenger liners be spared, eventually restricting submarine warfare to the Mediterranean. The Allies responded by arming their merchant ships, which made them dangerous opponents for the unarmored submarines on the surface. As Germany's political and military situation grew increasingly dire, advocates of unrestricted, that is, warningless, submarine warfare prevailed after intense internal debate. On February 1, 1917, unrestricted submarine warfare was resumed, a decision that led to the United States declaring war on Germany on April 6, 1917. Although the number of sinkings after February 1, 1917, rose dramatically and caused great alarm among the Allies, unrestricted submarine warfare fell far short of German expectations for a quick collapse of Britain. Improved defensive measures contributed to this failure. Merchant ships began sailing in convoys protected by warships, and even the transport of American troops across the Atlantic was barely affected. The unrestricted submarine campaign failed to alter the course of the war and proved a major disappointment for Germany. It was officially abandoned in October 1918 before the end of the war, in response to U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's 14 Points program. In total, 380 commissioned German submarines sank 5,554 Allied and neutral merchant ships, as well as numerous warships. The Imperial Navy lost 187 submarines with more than 5,000 crew members. Death and injury. All armies demanded daily the ultimate sacrifice from their officers and soldiers, their lushievs. Like artillery and ammunition, soldiers were treated as expendable material. Death, the constant companion of frontline soldiers, was glorified as a hero's death for the fatherland. More than 9 million soldiers died in the First World War, including over 2 million Germans, almost 1.5 million from Austria-Hungary, more than 1.8 million Russians, and nearly 460,000 Italians. France lost over 1.3 million soldiers, and Britain about 750,000. In addition, around 78,000 soldiers from the French colonies and 180,000 from the British colonies were killed. After entering the war in April 1917, the United States lost approximately 117,000 men in Europe. Shelters were meant to protect against shelling and enemy attacks. However, assaults on fortified enemy positions were far more deadly for the attackers than for the defenders. Row after row of men fell under the defensive fire of machine guns. Around half of all those killed in the First World War died from artillery fire. Every battle was reflected in the daily casualty lists. Tens of thousands of frontline soldiers who fell in no man's land between enemy lines became nameless dead, officially listed as missing. The surviving comrades were often unable to withstand the immense physical and psychological strain of the war. Many lost their sanity, while others resorted to self-mutilation to escape death or severe injury. Head wounds were common and often severe due to inadequate protection. The destructive power of the weapons left faces mutilated beyond recognition. To provide medical care for wounded soldiers in makeshift field hospitals near the front, a rapid evacuation to the rear lines was essential. This task fell to the stretcher bearers, whose work was among the most dangerous in the army. From the field hospitals, the wounded were transported further back, but wound infections often posed more serious problems than the initial injuries. Each soldier carried a personal first aid bandage packet for quick antiseptic treatment, a widespread provision of individual medical supplies introduced for the first time during World War I. Field hospitals frequently lacked dressings and medicines. Shortages of morphine often meant that the wards were filled with the moans of the severely wounded. In German military hospitals, only members of chivalric orders and Red Cross organizations were authorized to serve as volunteer nurses. At the outbreak of war in 1914, the German Red Cross had about 5,000 trained nurses, 1,000 assistant nurses, and an unknown number of female volunteers from women's associations. As the number of nurses proved insufficient, training of additional medical personnel began in 1914. In the field hospitals, they had to deal not only with injuries but also with diseases and epidemics. Typhus and gastrointestinal illnesses were common due to the unhygienic conditions in the trenches. Under these circumstances, typhoid fever and related diseases became particularly feared epidemics. In Russia, as well as on the northeastern front and especially in the Balkans, armies suffered severely from epidemic typhus, whose pathogens were transmitted by lice. Germany largely managed to prevent outbreaks through systematic delousing measures. By the end of the war in 1918, there were about 2.7 million physically and psychologically wounded veterans in Germany. The horrifying sight of disfigured and amputated men with prosthetic limbs became a common feature of everyday life in the post-war years. Prisoners of war. Between 6.6 and 8 million soldiers were taken prisoner during the First World War. Out of roughly 60 million soldiers mobilized, this represented more than 10% of all combatants. In the prisoner of war camps, soldiers retained their status and rank as officers or enlisted men. The treatment of prisoners of war was regulated by the Hague Convention on Land Warfare of 1907, which stipulated that prisoners were to be treated humanely and given the same standards of food and shelter as the captor's own troops. However, implementing these international legal provisions often proved difficult in practice. In many cases, international law was deliberately ignored. From 1916 onward, prisoners were forced to work in industry, mining, and agriculture to compensate for the labor shortages caused by heavy losses at the front. Grueling physical labor combined with poor nutrition led to high mortality rates among many prisoners, especially those who could not rely on food parcels from home. Almost 2.5 million people from 13 nations were held in German captivity. By 1915, over 100 POW camps had been established in Germany alone. On orders from the German Foreign Office, the so-called Half-Moon Camp, Halbmondlager, was established in February 1915 in Zossen, near Wunsdorf. Around 4,000 prisoners of predominantly Islamic faith from the French and British colonies were interned there. Among them were North and West Africans, Afghans, and Muslim Indians, who were allowed, at least in part, to practice their religious and cultural customs. Through targeted propaganda, the Germans sought to indoctrinate the prisoners against their colonial rulers and incite them to a holy war. A bi-weekly newspaper titled El Jihad was published in Arabic, Tatar, and Russian, with an initial circulation of 15,000 copies. It portrayed colonial powers as ruthless exploiters and framed uprisings against them as a sacred duty. However, the propaganda had little success. The presence of these exotic prisoners in their colorful traditional garments also drew the attention of artists. In the summer of 1916, several North African prisoners sat for portraits by the renowned Berlin painter Hans Lucian, 1859 to 1923. The barbed wire-enclosed mass camps for prisoners increasingly took on the character of small towns as the war went on. They developed their own administrations, newspapers, workshops, and medical facilities. Prisoners were allowed to receive mail from their families, though letters and parcels could do little to offset the harsh living conditions. Life in the camps was marked by inadequate food, disease, boredom, and depression. Occasionally, cultural activities such as theater performances and sports events organized by the prisoners themselves offered some relief from the monotony. By the end of 1918, more than 800,000 Germans had become prisoners of war. The last of them returned home from Allied camps in January 1920 after the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles. Following the fall of the German colony of Tsingtao in November 1914, about 5,000 citizens of the German Empire and Austria-Hungary were taken prisoner by Japan. They were transported to Japan and distributed among 15 camps. Within the Japanese Ministry of War, an Information Bureau for Prisoner of War Affairs was established, which handled communications with the International Red Cross. The Red Cross, beginning in August 1914, provided assistance to prisoners of war. Many families across Europe learned through the organization that their relatives were still alive. The Red Cross organized correspondence and relief shipments, which became a vital lifeline for prisoners during years of captivity. Through its humanitarian work, the Red Cross set new standards for the future development of international humanitarian law. In recognition of its efforts, it received the only Nobel Peace Prize awarded during the war, in 1917, the 14 Points Program. Despite its open sympathies for the Entente powers, the United States maintained formal neutrality until 1917. However, when Germany announced the start of unrestricted submarine warfare on January 31, 1917, the American government broke off diplomatic relations with the German Empire. 3 months later, President Woodrow Wilson signed the formal declaration of war against Germany. By the summer of that year, around 1 million American soldiers were already fighting for the Entente. Even after the U.S. entered the war, Wilson continued his efforts to achieve peace. On January 8, 1918, Wilson presented his 14 Points program to Congress, a peace proposal intended to be acceptable to all parties. It called for the evacuation of occupied territories and a general reorganization of Europe based on the principle of national self-determination. With only minor explanatory additions, the program was also published in the German press. However, just weeks after the October Revolution, the Russian revolutionaries had begun peace negotiations with Germany, culminating in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed on March 3, 1918. Following Russia's collapse, Germany hoped in the spring of 1918 to achieve victory through military means. The German government only agreed to consider Wilson's proposals once defeat had become unavoidable. By September 1918, the German army was collapsing, and the disintegration of its allied powers was becoming increasingly apparent. On September 14th, Emperor Charles I of Austria-Hungary sent a peace note to all warring nations, and shortly thereafter, Bulgaria opened negotiations with the Entente, resulting in an armistice on September 29th. Facing continuous Allied offensives on the Western Front, General Erich Ludendorff now urged an immediate German request for an armistice based on Wilson's 14 points. As a precondition to facilitate negotiations, Ludendorff demanded the parliamentarization of the empire and the formation of a new government. On October 3rd, Prince Max von Baden was appointed the new Chancellor of the Reich. One day later, Germany sent an armistice offer to Wilson through Switzerland. Battles in the Vosges and Alsace-Lorraine, August 1914. In the Battle of Mühlhausen, August 19th, and the battles in the Vosges and Lorraine, August 20th to 22nd, the first French offensives were repelled. During these major frontier battles, the French offensive stalled, while the German armies achieved significant breakthroughs. The British Expeditionary Force, defeated at Mons, was forced to retreat toward the English Channel. Battle of Mühlhausen, August 19th. Immediately after the outbreak of war, the French Second Southern Army launched an offensive across the border into Lorraine to encircle the German right flank from the rear. By August 6, 1914, French troops had occupied the Vosges mountain passes and began a ring-shaped assault on the Alsatian city of Mühlhausen, today Mulhouse, France. The weak German garrison withdrew, allowing the French to occupy the city. However, the still mobilizing German 7th Army soon launched a counterattack. Several German army corps pushed the French back and recaptured Mühlhausen. Since German troops were soon redeployed toward Verdun, French divisions once again advanced and retook Mühlhausen on August 17th. 2 days later, the French reoccupied the city. To prevent further French advances, 15 German battalions counterattacked but were forced to retreat due to superior enemy numbers. The French decided not to continue their advance and instead fortified Mühlhausen for defense. Battles in the Vosges and Lorraine, August 20th to 22nd. Following the initial engagements around Mühlhausen, the French Second Southern Army continued its offensive into Lorraine. To prepare a strategic counterattack, the German Sixth Army under Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, 1869 to 1955, carried out a tactical withdrawal on orders from Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke. After the skirmishes near Mühlhausen, French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre ordered a further advance toward Saarburg, today Sarrebourg, France. The German Supreme Army Command, OHL, reinforced the 7th Army with 6.5 divisions, originally designated as the last reserve for the German right flank under the Schlieffen Plan. Believing that the decisive battle in northern France had already been won and the advance toward the Marne could no longer be stopped. With these reinforcements, Crown Prince Ruprecht launched a counterattack against the French 1st and 2nd Armies near Saarburg and Morhange. Despite heavy losses, the Germans succeeded between August 20th and 22nd, 1914, in driving the French forces back across the border. They captured more than 10,000 prisoners and around 50 artillery pieces. However, this victory was soon overshadowed by the unexpected German defeat in the Battle of the Marne. The Battle of the Marne, 1914. In preparation for the feared two-front war against France and Russia, the chief of the German General Staff, Alfred von Schlieffen, had developed a military plan as early as 1905. This plan formed the basis for the German army's mobilization in August 1914. According to it, France was to be defeated first, after which the German forces would be transferred eastward against Russia. Advancing through Belgium, German troops pushed into northern France. However, the planned large-scale encirclement of Paris failed. With British support, French forces managed to halt the German advance at the Marne in September 1914. New weapons, such as machine guns and rapid-firing artillery, caused unexpectedly high casualties in the first weeks of the war. The belief in a quick victory proved to be an illusion. By the autumn of 1914, the Western Front had solidified into a dense system of trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. In August 1914, German and French soldiers entered the war wearing almost the same types of headgear used during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71. The German infantrymen wore a helmet with a spike, the so-called Pickelhaube, made of pressed leather. It had been introduced into the Prussian army in 1843 and had since become its trademark. The shiny yellow or white metal fittings of the helmet were covered in the field by a cloth protector from the late 19th century onward. The helmet shown here belonged to a soldier of the 117th Infantry Regiment. Infanterie. Leibregiment Großherzogin, 3rd Grand Ducal Hessian Regiment, which took part in the fighting at the Marne in September 1914. By September 1914, 5 German armies were positioned between Paris and Verdun. Unlike in Alfred von Schlieffen's original offensive plan, the German troops had not advanced to the English Channel, but had already turned southward east of Paris. At the Marne, they encountered a hastily assembled Anglo-French force formed for the defense of Paris. The Entente had decided to launch a counteroffensive between Paris and Verdun to regain the military initiative. The surprise attack opened a gap of about 40 kilometers between the German 1st and 2nd armies. When Allied forces advanced into this gap beginning on September 8th, Chief of the General Staff Helmut von Moltke ordered the battle to be halted. The German troops retreated about 80 kilometers to positions behind the Aisne River, followed cautiously by the British and French forces. On September 11th, the other German armies on the right flank also received orders to withdraw. The French soldiers facing the Germans at the Marne, including those of the 91st Infantry Regiment, wore red képis as headgear. This lightweight cap, originally designed for service in the North African colonies, had been introduced into the French army in the mid-19th century and had become a characteristic part of the uniform. To conceal the bright red color, which made them easy targets in the field, blue cloth covers were added during the war. Both the German leather helmet and the French cloth képi proved completely unsuitable for the new kind of warfare. After the German advance on Paris was halted in the Battle of the Marne in September 1914, which the French called the Miracle on the Marne, both sides began digging trenches and constructing dugouts. From that point on, trench warfare with artillery barrages and constant bombardments dominated the conflict. The number of soldiers killed or severely wounded by rifle fire and shell fragments in the early months of the war was so high that more effective protective measures were urgently sought. In 1915, the French army became the first to introduce a steel helmet. The German army followed in 1916. The Race to the Sea, October to November 1914. After the failure of the German encirclement offensive at the Battle of the Marne, Erich von Falkenhayn, the new chief of the German Supreme Army Command, Oberste Heeresleitung, OHL, sought to regain the military initiative by advancing toward the English Channel. His goal was to capture the Channel ports vital to the supply lines of the British Expeditionary Force and to encircle the Allied armies from the north. The Allies, for their part, also attempted to outflank the Germans along the coast and threw all available units into the northern sector. The German advance, which began in early October 1914 from the Ghent-Lille line northward toward the coast, was delayed by the strong Belgian resistance at Antwerp. The city was not captured until October 9th. Ghent fell on October 12th and Bruges 2 days later. On November 15th, German troops reached the channel near Newport and captured the ports of Zeebrugge and Ostend. However, by that time, the Entente had managed to establish a continuous defensive line from Amiens to the coast. Belgian troops had opened the sluices at Newport, flooding the land and preventing further German advance in the coastal area. Although the Germans outnumbered the Allies in this sector, many of their units consisted of hastily trained war volunteers, causing offensives such as the one at Langemarck to fail. In addition, British naval artillery and subsequent Allied reinforcements prevented a breakthrough along the front. The fighting along the Channel coast thus also settled into trench warfare. The ports of Zeebrugge and Ostend were subsequently developed into important bases for the German submarine campaign. The capture of Liège, August 5th to 16th, 1914. 2 days after the occupation of Luxembourg, German troops invaded Belgium on August 4, 1914. The initial assault was concentrated on Liège, a fortress city built at the end of the 19th century and surrounded by a ring of 12 forts. The rapid capture of Liège was essential for the advance of the German right wing and the successful execution of the Schlieffen Plan. 6 German infantry brigades attempted to secure the Meuse River crossings and encircle the Liège region. Hopes for a quick victory were dashed by unexpectedly strong Belgian resistance. The ensuing siege of the fortress tied down more German troops and lasted longer than the Supreme Army Command had anticipated. The city was only captured on August 7, 1914, under the leadership of Erich Ludendorff, when large parts of the Belgian army withdrew toward Antwerp. The last outer fort fell on August 16th. Since the invasion of Belgium, whose annexation had long been a central objective of German war aims, the local population mounted unexpectedly fierce resistance against the occupying forces. The harsh suppression of this resistance by the German military administration and the sometimes brutal actions against Belgian civilians, including executions, became major themes of Allied propaganda against Germany. The Battle of Gumbinnen, August 19th to 20th, 1914. In the East, military developments unfolded quite differently than the German Supreme Army Command, OHL, had expected. Russia had mobilized its troops far earlier than anticipated. In the northern sector of the Eastern Front, Germany's 8th Army in East Prussia faced 2 Russian armies. In the south, 4 Austro-Hungarian armies in Galicia were also confronted by a numerically superior enemy. From the German perspective, the first battle in the east, the Battle of Gumbinnen, August 19th to 20th, ended disastrously. Fearing encirclement, the commander of the 8th Army ordered a retreat from East Prussia behind the Vistula River, leaving the East Prussian population exposed to the Russian invasion. Contrary to German expectations, Russian forces launched their offensive in mid-August 1914, much earlier than the OHL had planned. At that time, the Eastern Front was defended only by the German 8th Army. Before Russia had even completed its full mobilization, the 1st Russian Army, Niemann Army, and the 2nd Russian Army, Nariv Army, under pressure from their Entente allies, advanced into East Prussia with the aim of encircling the German forces. To counter this threat, the German 8th Army under Colonel General Max von Prittwitz, 1848 to 1917, attacked the Niemann Army but suffered a decisive defeat at Gumbinnen, today Gusev, Russia, on August 19th to 20th, 1914, with heavy losses. To avoid being surrounded by the approaching Nariv Army, Prittwitz ordered a retreat behind the Vistula, effectively abandoning East Prussia to the Russian armies. The civilian population fled in panic to escape the advancing Russians. Prittwitz's retreat order was harshly criticized by the OHL and led to his immediate dismissal. He was replaced by the retired General Paul von Hindenburg, with Erich Ludendorff appointed as his chief of staff. Reinforced by units transferred from the Western Front, they managed to turn the tide, defeating the Russians in the subsequent battles of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes. Battles near Verdun, September 22nd to 25th, 1914. Thanks to their unexpectedly successful victory in the Battle of the Marne, the French were able to maintain their connection to the fortress of Verdun. This well-fortified stronghold posed a major threat to German supply lines and was the most important cornerstone of the French defensive front. In mid-September 1914, several German army corps advanced from the Varennes-Montfaucon line toward Verdun, attempting to encircle the fortress in a semicircle and cut it off from the Entente front. However, the attack failed due to strong French defenses on the heights surrounding Verdun and in the Argonne region. Fighting then shifted to the area between the Meuse and Moselle rivers. On the heights along the Meuse, the Central Powers positioned their heavy artillery and began shelling Verdun's ring of defensive forts. After 30 hours of artillery bombardment, German infantry units launched an assault on Fort Camp de Romains on September 24th. A French counterattack attempted to relieve the fort, but the Germans managed to capture its outer defenses. Despite fierce resistance from the French garrison, the Germans succeeded in taking the forward fort on September 25, 1914. However, the complete conquest of Verdun itself proved impossible at this stage. Battle of Langemarck, November 10, 1914. Following the Battle of the Marne, French and British attempts to break through the strengthening German front lines failed. The Germans achieved only minor successes in the battles near Verdun, September 22nd to 25th. In Belgium, they captured Antwerp, Ghent, Bruges, and Ostend. By mid-October, Belgium was almost entirely under German control and placed under military administration. However, during the race to the sea, the Germans failed to seize the crucial channel ports along the French coast. Their advance was halted by fierce Anglo-French resistance near the Yser Canal and Ypres. The Allies also failed to achieve a breakthrough or encirclement, and the Western Front soon froze into trench warfare. From the Channel coast to the Vosges Mountains, both sides entrenched themselves and built strong defensive fortifications. Storming these fortified positions proved nearly impossible. At Langemarck on November 10, 1914, hundreds of young German volunteers were cut down by machine gun fire while attempting to charge fortified Allied positions. After the failure of the Schlieffen Plan, the German Supreme Army Command, OHL, hoped during the race to the sea to outflank part of the Allied forces with an advance between Lille and the Channel coast. Beginning on October 20, 1914, German troops repeatedly tried to break through the still weak Entente defensive lines. Many of these offensives relied heavily on inadequately trained reserve corps composed of young war volunteers, students, and schoolboys. As a result, casualty rates among these recruits were devastatingly high. On November 10, 1914, over 2,000 young soldiers were killed while attempting to capture a ridge near the village of Langemarck. Advancing uphill, they were easy targets for the machine gunners above and were mowed down in minutes. The next day, the official German army report claimed that the young soldiers had attacked while singing the Deutschlandlied, Song of Germany. The myth of Langemarck elevated their sacrifice into a symbol of selfless heroism and glorified their hero's death. The name Langemarck became a lasting nationalistic rallying cry, even beyond the Weimar Republic, invoking the ideal of noble self-sacrifice for the nation and the fatherland. The Battle of Tannenberg, 1914. Much faster than expected by the German General Staff, two Russian armies invaded large parts of East Prussia in 1914. After the German defeat at Gumbinnen and the retreat of the Eighth Army, the situation on the Eastern Front was extremely precarious for the German Supreme Army Command, OHL. Under the new leadership of Paul von Hindenburg and Ischik Ludendorff, the 150,000-strong German army was reorganized and, despite being outnumbered, launched a counteroffensive. Its target was the Russian Second Army, Narev Army, near Allenstein, today Olsztyn, Poland. Between August 26 and 31, 1914, German forces successfully encircled the Narev. Mdinintzi's army. Although the first Russian army, Neman Army, was only a day's march away to the north, the Germans had intercepted and decoded Russian radio messages and were therefore aware of their operational plans. Confident in this intelligence, Hindenburg deployed only a single cavalry division to cover his northern flank. The Germans also benefited from superior artillery and from the slowness of the Russian forces, which, still not fully mobilized, had entered East Prussia prematurely under pressure from their Entente allies. By the end of August 1914, the German Eighth Army had decisively defeated the numerically superior Russian Narev Army. Never before in military history had so many soldiers been captured in a single battle. Less than 500 kilometers from Berlin, over 90,000 Russian troops were taken prisoner. Soldiers who, according to many Germans, had been marching toward the capital to unleash terror through looting and assaults. Deep-seated fear of the uncivilized Russian army and its supposedly uncontrollable Cossack hordes gripped the German population, further inflamed by press propaganda warning of Asiatic marauders. After the Battle of Tannenberg, the Russian Neman army retreated to defensive positions northwest of the Masurian Lakes. To attack them, the victorious German Eighth Army was reinforced by 5 infantry and 1 cavalry division transferred from the Western Front. Beginning on September 8, 1914, the Army's right wing advanced south of the Russian lines, through the lake region, encircling their positions. Facing encirclement, the Russians withdrew after brief fighting, leaving behind 45,000 prisoners. With the Russian offensive in East Prussia now completely crushed, the two German victories were celebrated with euphoria across the nation. Paul von Hindenburg quickly became a national hero, the victor of Tannenberg, and the liberator of East Prussia. Around him, a powerful cult of personality emerged. He symbolized strength, calmness, and leadership, embodying the nation's yearning for heroic figures and providing reassurance in a time of fear and uncertainty. Hindenburg's image as a steadfast and commanding leader gave Germans hope for ultimate victory. His reputation, born not from state propaganda, but from genuine popular admiration, soon made him the personification of national unity and military success. This public adoration laid the foundation for his later rise. In 1916, together with his brilliant strategist and chief of staff Erich Ludendorff, Hindenburg assumed command of the Supreme Army Command, Oberste Heeresleitung, wielding far-reaching authoritarian powers. Winter Battle in the Carpathians, December 1914, April 1915. Since the military and economic strength of the Central Powers was insufficient to sustain a long two-front war, the German High Command now sought to defeat Russia with a decisive offensive. Following the victorious Winter Battle in Masuria, the Germans succeeded in driving the Russian army out of East Prussia. After a series of shifting engagements, German and Austro-Hungarian forces managed to repel a threatened Russian invasion of Hungary during the Winter Battle in the Carpathians. At the same time as the Masurian campaign, the Central Powers launched another offensive in the Carpathians at the beginning of 1915 to relieve the pressure on their ally Austria-Hungary on the Eastern Front. Around 130,000 Austro-Hungarian soldiers had been besieged since November 1914 in the fortress city of Przemyśl, today Przemyśl, Poland. As supplies dwindled, the fortress faced imminent capitulation, and with it the danger of a Russian breakthrough into Hungary. For the relief offensive, a joint South Army was formed from German and Austro-Hungarian units, consisting of 6 infantry and 2 cavalry divisions. The offensive, which began on January 23, 1915, quickly bogged down due to the mountainous terrain and heavy snowstorms. In this sparsely populated region, maintaining supply lines proved extremely difficult, and casualties were catastrophic. The Austro-Hungarian Second Army alone reported the loss of 40,000 of its 95,000 soldiers by mid-March. 6,000 had been killed in action, while the rest had died of disease or cold. The relief of Przemyśl failed. The fortress garrison capitulated on March 22nd. However, the Russian advance toward Hungary also stalled, mainly due to the harsh weather and supply shortages, which caused heavy losses on both sides. By April, the fighting in the Carpathians subsided. More than 300,000 soldiers had perished in total. Winter Battle in Masuria, February 7th to 25th, 1915. Because the Central Powers lacked the resources to sustain a prolonged two-front war, the German High Command sought to defeat Russia through a decisive strike. The victorious Winter Battle in Masuria succeeded in driving the Russian army from East Prussia. After fluctuating battles, German and Austro-Hungarian troops then held off a Russian incursion into Hungary in the Carpathian Winter Battle. December 1914, April 1915. On February 7, 1915, German forces launched a major offensive against the remaining Russian troops in eastern East Prussia. Reinforced by the newly formed 10th Army, the Germans now fielded 15 combat-ready divisions against 11 Russian divisions. Attempting to encircle the Russian army near Augustów, the Germans advanced south of the Memel River in a pincer movement. After 2 weeks of heavy fighting, the Russians were driven out of East Prussia. Lacking reserves and fortified defensive lines, 4 Russian divisions, about 100,000 men, were unable to retreat in time and were captured. However, Hindenburg and Ludendorff failed to achieve a decisive war-ending victory. Snowstorms and heavy rain hindered the advance and the movement of artillery. Most Russian units managed to withdraw eastward, and with reinforcements, Russia established a new defensive line. Attempts by the Central Powers to break through this line near Grodno, now Hrodna, Belarus, failed in early March. Nonetheless, the liberation of East Prussia was celebrated as a major triumph by the German public. Winter and autumn battles in Champagne, 1915. The year 1915 brought no decisive outcome, though the ferocious fighting drove casualties into the millions. Battles characterized by massive artillery fire turned entire regions into desolate, cratered wastelands. The year began with the Winter Battle of Champagne, February 16th to March 20th, in which the Germans repelled repeated French breakthrough attempts. The introduction of poison gas, used for the first time by the German army during the Second Battle of Ypres, April 22nd or May 25th, marked a horrifying escalation of warfare. Later that year, France's so-called Autumn Battle of Champagne, September 22nd and November 6th, became the first major war of Materialschlacht, with enormous losses on both sides. The Winter Battle, February 16th to March 20th, 1915. On the Western Front, which had solidified into trench warfare, British and French forces launched a major joint offensive in Champagne after several failed local attacks. The aim was to relieve pressure on Russia, which the Central Powers were trying to force into a separate peace through their successful winter offensives in the east. After weeks of intense artillery barrages, 17 infantry and 3 cavalry divisions began their assault near Reims on February 16, 1915, against the numerically inferior German defenders. To support this, the British First Army launched an offensive at Neuve-Chapelle on March 10th, attempting to break through toward Lille. Outnumbered, the Germans were forced to withdraw from some forward positions. However, since the attacks were concentrated on narrow fronts, the Germans were able to redeploy reserves to threatened sectors and prevent a breakthrough. By late March, the Allies called off the assault due to enormous casualties against well-fortified German trench systems. French losses alone amounted to around 240,000 killed, wounded, and captured. The Autumn Battle, September 22nd, November 6, 1915. To relieve pressure on the Eastern Front, the Entente launched another massive offensive in the Champagne region on September 22, 1915. With even greater manpower and artillery than in the winter, the Allies hoped to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The French fielded 27 divisions with 1,650 guns against just 7 German divisions with 475 guns. Following days of intense bombardment, the Allies attacked along a 32-kilometer front. They achieved a penetration up to 3 kilometers deep, threatening the German rear positions. However, before reaching the unbroken second defensive line, the French offensive stalled. The German Supreme Command, OHL, quickly reinforced the endangered sectors with reserves from the Eastern Front, preventing a breakthrough. Despite renewed French assaults from October 6th onward, the Germans held firm and even launched limited counterattacks in mid-October. By early November, the Entente halted its operations, despite firing approximately 5.4 million shells, having achieved no strategic gain. The Autumn Battle of Champagne cost the Allies around 250,000 casualties and the Germans about 150,000. Dardanelles Offensive, March 18th to December 1915. Following the Allied attack on the Dardanelles and Bulgaria's entry into the war on the side of the Central Powers, the focus of military operations in the second half of 1915 increasingly shifted to the Balkans. By the end of the year, the Central Powers had conquered Serbia, Montenegro, and Albania, thereby securing an important land connection to their ally, the Ottoman Empire. Since the beginning of the First World War, the Central Powers had controlled the Dardanelles Strait through their alliance with the Ottoman Empire. This blocked the Russian Black Sea Fleet from accessing the Mediterranean and cut off Allied supply routes to Russia. After the Western Front had settled into trench warfare in northern France, the Entente decided in spring 1915 to attack the Dardanelles in order to open the strait for shipping and capture Constantinople, now Istanbul. Powerful Allied naval forces were assembled in the Aegean for the operation. However, a direct naval breakthrough attempt on March 18th failed due to extensive minefields and attacks by German submarines. On April 25th, 5 Allied infantry divisions, over 75,000 men, landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula, today Gelibolu, Turkey, to destroy Turkish coastal batteries and secure control of the strait. Under the protection of naval artillery, the Allies established a beachhead, which was later reinforced with troops from Australia and New Zealand, Anzac, bringing their strength to over 200,000 soldiers. Nevertheless, the conquest of the Rocky Peninsula failed due to the fierce resistance of the Ottoman army. On December 19, 1915, the Allies began evacuating their forces from Gallipoli as the Central Powers, following their successful Balkan campaign, had by then secured a land-based supply route to the Ottoman Empire. Already in June, British First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill, who had strongly advocated for the landings, had been dismissed from his post. The Battle of Ypres. Input. 1915. After the Germans had successfully repelled the Entente's attacks during the winter battle in Champagne, up to March 1915, they attempted to seize the initiative in April 1915. The German 4th and 6th Armies were ordered to launch an offensive near Ypres in Flanders. While the Allies hoped to break the stalemate through massive artillery bombardments, the Germans, in direct violation of international law, introduced a new and horrifying weapon, poison gas. As the Western Front stagnated in late 1914, military planners on all sides sought ways to break the deadlock. The French army was the first to use tear gas, firing it into German trenches to drive soldiers out into the open. On the German side, research into chemical warfare had been led since January 1915 by Professor Fritz Haber, director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physical Chemistry. Once tear gas was accepted as a legitimate weapon, German military leaders grew willing to employ a far deadlier chemical agent, chlorine gas. On April 22, 1915, this lethal weapon was used for the first time. Released from pressurized cylinders, a 6-kilometer-wide cloud of chlorine gas drifted toward French trenches. Several hundred soldiers died of burned lungs, and thousands more suffered severe injuries. The Germans used the ensuing chaos to launch an assault on Allied positions, but lacking reserves, they failed to achieve a major breakthrough. Only minor territorial gains and a straightening of the front line were achieved, while the city of Ypres remained in Allied hands. By the end of the offensive on May 25, 1915, German losses amounted to around 35,000 men. The Allies suffered roughly twice as many casualties. The horror at the use of poison gas was immense, yet it was overshadowed by the belief on both sides that such weapons could bring victory. Both armies soon began to employ chemical warfare more frequently. Instead of releasing gas from cylinders, they developed safer and more effective methods, such as firing gas shells and gas-filled mines. The Breakthrough Battle of Gorlice-Tarnów, 1915. The enormous losses suffered by Austria-Hungary in the Carpathian Campaign during spring 1915 prompted the German Supreme Army Command, OHL, to assume overall strategic control of operations on the southern sector of the Eastern Front and to plan a major offensive. The aim was to support Austria-Hungary through military success. For a concentrated attack near Gorlice-Tarnów, the German 11th Army and the Austro-Hungarian 4th Army were placed under the command of Colonel General August von Mackensen. Additional troops were withdrawn from the Western Front, giving the Central Powers a significant numerical advantage over the Russians. The assault began on May 1, 1915, following hours of intense artillery bombardment. On a 16-kilometer front, German and Austro-Hungarian forces broke 4 kilometers deep into Russian lines. After 3 days of fighting, the advancing infantry breached the Russian defensive system, forcing a general retreat. This marked the first major strategic breakthrough against a fortified trench system in World War I and allowed the Central Powers over the following weeks to push the Russian front back by about 100 kilometers and to capture Lemberg, today Lviv, Ukraine, on June 22, 1915. As the Russian army retreated deep into its own territory, it adopted the scorched earth policy reminiscent of the Napoleonic Wars. The civilian population suffered immensely. The retreat was chaotic and uncoordinated. Bridges and buildings were destroyed, livestock slaughtered, and food supplies burned. Jewish villages were particularly often looted. Russian soldiers, already poorly supplied and equipped, were outraged to find ammunition and food depots destroyed by their own forces. By the winter of 1914-15, the Russian army's shortages of weapons and food had become critical. Entire battalions were trained without rifles, and officers at the front were ordered to limit soldiers to just 10 shots per day due to ammunition scarcity. The disastrous logistics and indifference of high command toward the suffering and losses of their troops severely undermined morale and loyalty to the Tsarist regime. When the Central Powers' advance finally bogged down in the mud of the Russian interior in late 1915, the Russian army had been reduced to one-third of its original strength. Among both soldiers and their families, faith in the government had collapsed. Though the troops were still willing to fight and die for the Tsar, this would fundamentally change over the next 2 years, paving the way for revolution. Battle of Tarnopol, September 6th to 19th, 1915. Following the successful breakthrough Battle of Gorlice-Tarnów, Austro-Hungarian forces launched another major offensive in Ukraine in August 1915. Their goal was to capture the Russian fortress triangle of Lutsk, Dubno, and Rovno. The attack was carried out by the Austro-Hungarian 7th Army and the newly formed South Army, which included German units. Together, they pushed back the Russian front and advanced as far as the Sareth River. After capturing Lutsk on August 31, 1915, the Austro-Hungarian army also seized Dubno on September 8th. The Russians managed to hold their positions only in the area around Tarnopol, today Ternopil, Ukraine. Given the precarious military situation, Tsar Nicholas II personally assumed command of the army and ordered a counteroffensive. By mid-September, Russian troops halted the Austro-Hungarian advance in the Battle of Tarnopol and then launched a counterattack of their own. Only at the Styr River were the Austro-Hungarian forces, reinforced by German units, able to stop the Russian advance. The Central Powers' victories in Poland and Galicia contributed to Bulgaria's entry into the war on their side on October 14, 1915. Fighting continued into the New Year's Battle of Galicia, after which the Eastern Front, from Chernovitz, now Chernivtsi, Ukraine, to Dubno, solidified into trench warfare. New Year's Battle. In Galicia, mid-December 1915, mid-January 1916. After the failed Dardanelles offensive and the occupation of Serbia by the Central Powers, Russian commanders hoped to persuade neutral Romania to join the Entente by launching a successful offensive on the Eastern Front. They believed Romanian support could turn the tide in Russia's favor. Following their temporary success in halting the Austro-Hungarian advance at Tarnopol on September 6th to 19th, 1915, the Russians attempted further breakthroughs, but without success. After the New Year's battle, the Eastern Front increasingly froze into positional warfare. In mid-December 1915, Russian forces began a large-scale assault along a 130-kilometer front between Chernovitz, now Chernivtsi, Ukraine, and the lower Dniester River. However, they achieved only minor gains. From December 24th onward, the Russians concentrated their attacks on Austro-Hungarian bridgeheads along the Dniester and Styr rivers, but fierce fighting ended with their defeat. In early 1916, the Russians renewed their attacks again without decisive results. On January 15, 1916, the offensive was called off. The brutal winter weather and strong Austro-Hungarian defenses made further progress impossible. During the New Year's battles, Russian losses reached nearly 70,000 men, while Romania still remained out of the war. The Brusilov Offensives, 1916. In 1916, the Entente sought to wear down the Central Powers through coordinated large-scale offensives on both major fronts. While the Somme offensive was still being prepared in the West, Russia launched a massive attack on June 4, 1916, along a 300-kilometer front. The main Russian assault targeted the northern sector, while another, led by General Alexei A. Brusilov, 1853–1926, struck the Austro-Hungarian lines by its lines in the south, originally intended as a diversion. However, despite roughly equal strength on both sides, Brusilov's forces completely overran the Austro-Hungarian front between Romania and the Styr River. Seizing the initiative, Brusilov rapidly exploited the breakthrough, achieving what became the greatest Russian victory of the entire First World War. In just 3 days, Austria-Hungary lost over 200,000 men. half of them taken prisoner. Poor morale among the empire's ethnically divided troops was a decisive factor. The Russians advanced up to 80 kilometers deep and pushed forward almost along the entire southeastern front. Lutsk, Ukraine, fell on June 7th, and Chernovitz, now Chernivtsi, Ukraine, on June 18th. Brusilov's wide front tactics prevented the Austro-Hungarian command from concentrating reserves at threatened points. Only after reinforcements from the German Western Front arrived was the Russian offensive finally halted west of the Styr River. By July 1916, the Russians had advanced deep into Bukovina, prompting Romania to join the Entente. After a short pause, Brusilov launched a renewed offensive, concentrating 66 infantry and 23 cavalry divisions, over 700,000 men, against roughly 420,000 Austro-Hungarian soldiers. The goal was to recapture Lemberg, today Lviv, Ukraine, and push into Hungary. On August 8, 1916, the Russians began their large-scale assault in Galicia and Bukovina. While German troops successfully repelled another attack near Kovel, Ukraine, the Austro-Hungarian army was forced to retreat and could not bring in reinforcements due to heavy Italian attacks along the Isonzo River. Although the feared Russian breakthrough and their link-up with Romanian forces were ultimately prevented after fierce fighting in the Carpathians, the Central Powers soon stabilized their eastern front by launching a successful counter-offensive against Romania. To support the Romanians, the Russians launched the Third Brusilov Offensive in October 1916, aimed at breaking through into Hungary via Bukovina and the Carpathians. The attacks near Lutsk and the mountain passes met stubborn Austro-Hungarian resistance, while the Romanian invasion of Transylvania collapsed under counterattacks by the Central Powers. Brusilov was forced to divert increasing numbers of troops to Moldavia to support his faltering ally. Meanwhile, the joint German-Austro-Hungarian victory in the Romanian campaign worsened Russia's situation. By December 1916, the offensive was abandoned, and Russian reinforcements were sent to the Romanian front. 35 infantry and 13 cavalry divisions, nearly one-quarter of all Russian forces. Although the three Brusilov offensives did not bring a decisive victory on the Eastern Front, they inflicted catastrophic losses on Austria-Hungary, about 1 million casualties, many of them prisoners or deserters. German losses reached roughly 350,000 men. The Russians, too, suffered over 1.5 million casualties. Despite their initial success, the offensives failed to achieve a breakthrough and instead drained Russia's strength, deeply undermining the morale and will to fight of the Russian people. The Battle of the Somme, 1916. To relieve the French forces under heavy pressure at Verdun, the British launched an offensive in June 1916. This required the creation of a volunteer army on a scale never before seen in British history. The plan was to break through the German front along the River Somme in northern France. A week-long artillery bombardment was intended to destroy the German defenses, but it failed to do so. When the British infantry advanced on July 1, 1916, they were met with intact barbed wire and relentless machine gun fire from experienced German troops. Nearly 20,000 British soldiers were killed, many of them within the first minutes of the attack, the highest number of British casualties in a single day in the country's history. The Battle of the Somme quickly turned into a war of attrition. By the time the fighting was called off in the autumn of 1916, both the Germans and the British had suffered about 500,000 casualties each, while the French had lost around 200,000 men. The bloody failure of the Anglo-French offensive demonstrated that, under the conditions of modern warfare, the defenders had a significant tactical advantage. Plans for the Somme offensive had already been agreed upon by the Entente in December 1915. Alongside the Brusilov offensive in the east, it was intended to exhaust the Central Powers through a two-front war. After 5 days of continuous shelling, 20 British and 11 French divisions went over the top on July 1, 1916. Each soldier was heavily burdened with tools and equipment to fortify the supposedly destroyed German first lines once they were taken. However, during nearly 2 years of occupation, the Germans had transformed their positions along the Somme into underground fortresses. The attackers, moving slowly and weighed down, were mowed down by German machine guns. The British assault collapsed under the defensive fire. With 58,000 casualties in a single day, Britain suffered its heaviest losses of the entire war. The French achieved small initial gains, but by July 5th, the entire offensive had stalled. A second wave of attacks began on July 20th, allowing the Allies to push up to 7 kilometers deep into the German lines. After weeks of shelling, another major assault was launched on August 24th along a 40-kilometer front, but it too was repelled. When the operation was finally abandoned at the end of 1916, the Allies, despite deploying 104 divisions with around 2.5 million men, had gained less than 10 kilometers of ground. The Siegfried Line, Hindenburg Line. The immense material battles and massive casualties of 1916 placed the Central Powers in a precarious position, as the balance of military power was shifting increasingly in favor of the Entente. After the costly Battle of the Somme, the new French commander-in-chief, Georges Robert Nivelle, 1858 to 1924, planned to exploit Germany's numerical inferiority on the Western Front with a surprise offensive in the spring of 1917. The goal was a large-scale assault along the 30-kilometer ridge known as the Chemin des Dames, intended to cut off the German front between Arras and the Aisne River. However, due to poor secrecy on the French side, the German Supreme Command, OHL, learned of these plans and prepared a major strategic withdrawal to a pre-built defensive line stretching from Arras through Saint-Quentin-Saint-Denis to Soissons. The Germans called this fortified system the Siegfried Line, while the Allies referred to it as the Hindenburg Line, after General Paul von Hindenburg, who had been appointed commander-in-chief in 1916. Under the code name Operation Outbreak, 4 German armies began their strategic withdrawal in late February 1917. During the retreat, the Germans systematically devastated the abandoned territory, destroying infrastructure, burning villages, and evacuating approximately 125,000 civilians by force. By shortening the front from 170 to 125 kilometers, Germany freed up 13 divisions and a large number of artillery pieces. In combination with the Hindenburg Program, a massive effort to expand arms production, this allowed the OHL to replenish its depleted forces. The Entente would not manage to break through the Hindenburg Line until October 1918, just before the Armistice of Compiègne. The Battle of Jutland, Skagerrak, May 31st to June 1st, 1916. At sea, a direct confrontation between the powerful British Home Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet had been avoided during the first 2 years of the war. On May 31, 1916, the German High Seas Fleet, consisting of 112 ships, set out from Wilhelmshaven to attack a British cruiser squadron in the North Sea. Warned by aerial reconnaissance, the British Home Fleet, 150 ships strong, sailed from Scapa Flow, Orkney Islands, the same day to intercept the Germans off the coast of Denmark. Neither side had an accurate picture of the other's strength. In the afternoon, the British cruiser Galatea and the German cruiser Elbing, along with their accompanying torpedo boats, encountered each other by chance and engaged in a brief skirmish. The Germans inflicted heavy damage, but soon faced the arrival of the British main fleet and came under pressure themselves. To prevent the British from forming an advantageous battle line, the German fleet, with its 16 battleships, launched an immediate attack on the superior British force, which had 28 battleships. As darkness fell, the Germans skillfully disengaged and turned southeast to evade the British pursuit. The British fleet, attempting to cut off their return route, sailed south toward Heligoland. However, during the night, the German fleet managed to break through the British rearguard and returned safely to its North Sea bases. The outcome of the Battle of Jutland was regarded as a moral victory for Germany. The Germans sank about 115,000 tons of enemy shipping, nearly twice the British total, including 3 battleships, 3 armored cruisers, and 8 destroyers. German losses included the battleship Lützow, the dreadnought Pommern, the cruisers Wiesbaden, Rostock, Elbing, Frauenlob, and 5 torpedo boats. The British lost 6,094 men, while the Germans lost 2,551, among them the writer Gorch Fock. Despite this tactical success, the battle did nothing to alter the overall strategic situation. The British home fleet retained control of the seas, and the Royal Navy's blockade of Germany remained firmly in place. Spring offensives of the Entente, 1917. After the costly and unsuccessful Battle of the Somme in 1916, the new French commander-in-chief Georges Robert Nivelle, 1858 to 1924, sought to change strategy. Unlike his predecessor, Joseph Joffre, who had relied on massive use of men and material to wear down the Central Powers, Nivelle aimed to achieve a breakthrough on the Western Front through a concentrated double blow, making use of the Entente's numerical superiority. By March 1917, the Germans, anticipating a major Entente offensive, had withdrawn to the Siegfried Line, Hindenburg Line, thereby significantly improving their defensive position. Nevertheless, the British assembled 33 divisions and 60 tanks near Arras. After several days of artillery bombardment meant to destroy the German front lines, the British offensive began on April 9, 1917, along a 25-kilometer front. Over the next 5 weeks, supported heavily by air power, the British managed to push the Germans back several kilometers between Linz and Fontaine. But a decisive breakthrough was not achieved anywhere. Coordinated with the British attack at Arras, the French army under General Neuville launched a massive offensive along the Aisne River and in the Champagne region on April 6, 1917. The first French assault targeted the line between Soissons and Reims. After a 9-day artillery barrage, they captured the 30-kilometer-long Chemin des Dames Ridge, which, however, was lost again in the 1918 battle of the same name. Despite this initial success, the strategic plan had failed. The Entente achieved no decisive breakthrough, and French casualties were extremely high due to the strong German defenses. The second major attack targeted German positions in the Champagne region. Here, too, while the Germans lost some ground, the offensive was soon halted. The enormous French losses provoked fierce criticism of Neuvelle's strategy within the general staff and triggered mutinies and uprisings among French soldiers. Nivelle was dismissed and replaced by Henri-Philippe Pétain, who limited operations to smaller attacks. Despite these efforts, the Germans held their line. By the end of May 1917, the Entente called off the offensive. Once again, its strategic goal, a decisive breakthrough, had failed. The United States enters the war, 1917. Although the United States declared neutrality at the start of the war, it provided extensive economic support to the Entente and supplied them with military goods. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson tried to uphold international maritime law and safeguard neutral shipping and overseas trade. However, American protests against the British naval blockade went unanswered. U.S.-German relations deteriorated sharply in 1915 when a German U-boat sank the British passenger liner Lusitania, killing nearly 1,200 people, including 139 American citizens. Later, with the introduction of the intensified submarine warfare policy in late February 1916, German submarines began treating armed merchant ships from neutral countries as enemy warships, attacking them without warning. In a note to the United States on May 6, 1916, Germany promised to return to the established rules of naval warfare, but only if Britain also complied with international law, something Britain refused to do, insisting on maintaining its blockade. Consequently, on February 1, 1917, Germany announced the unrestricted submarine warfare, citing Britain's blockade as a violation of international law. German submarines now attacked even unarmed neutral ships without warning. 2 days later, the United States broke off diplomatic relations with Germany. In early April, Congress followed Wilson's recommendation, declaring that the U.S. considered itself at war with Germany due to the submarine campaign. On April 6, 1917, the United States formally declared war. At that time, the U.S. had only a small standing army and had to raise a powerful mass army through rapid recruitment. Uncle Sam posters called on American men to join the military. With its vast resources, the U.S. entry into the war shifted the balance of power in Europe decisively in favor of the Entente. By the summer of 1918, around 2 million American soldiers were fighting on the Western Front against exhausted German forces. Counteroffensive in Galicia, July 19th to mid-August 1917. While the war in the West had degenerated into bitter, bloody trench warfare by 1917, the Russian February Revolution increasingly paralyzed the Eastern Front. After initial gains from Brusilov's offensives had failed, the Central Powers launched a counteroffensive in eastern Galicia beginning on July 19, 1917. To recapture Bukovina and Galicia, which had been lost during the First Brusilov offensive, the Central Powers attacked the now demoralized Russian troops. In this carefully prepared operation, the Austro-Hungarian Second Army advanced toward Tarnopol, today Ternopil, Ukraine. After breaking through the Russian lines, additional Central Power units joined the assault. On July 25, 1917, Tarnopol was captured. The Russian front was shattered along a 200-kilometer sector, and the retreating troops fell back more than 100 kilometers to the Sareth River. On August 2, 1917, the Central Powers occupied Chernovitz, today Chernivtsi, Ukraine, thus regaining almost all of eastern Galicia and Bukovina. Although they failed to encircle large Russian formations, the operation revealed the collapse of the Russian army. The enormous losses suffered during the Third Brusilov offensive the previous year, combined with the effects of the February Revolution, led to mass desertions, uprisings, and mutinies, making any effective defense of the Russian front impossible. The Battle of Cambrai, at 1917. During the Entente's offensive in Flanders, British forces launched a massive tank assault at Cambrai, November 20, 1917, the first large-scale and coordinated use of tanks in warfare. Although the first armored tanks had already appeared in 1916, Cambrai demonstrated for the first time the true effectiveness of this new weapon. The British attacked a lightly manned section of the German Siegfried Line, Hindenburg Line, near Cambrai. Early in the morning, they used smoke shells to obscure their approach, and instead of the usual preliminary artillery barrage, they launched a surprise assault with 378 combat tanks and 98 supply tanks. The tanks crushed the barbed wire entanglements and crossed German trenches with ease, sending the surprised defenders fleeing in panic. Within a few hours, the British tanks had advanced up to 10 kilometers, and cavalry units pushed into the outskirts of Cambrai, whose civilian population had been evacuated by German military authorities. With only light initial losses, the British took about 10,000 German prisoners and captured numerous guns. However, their rapid advance created major logistical problems, allowing the Germans to regroup and counterattack on November 23, 1917, regaining almost all lost territory. Despite this, the battle proved that the Germans had no effective defense against tanks. The offensive, which continued until early December and cost around 95,000 casualties on both sides, brought no significant territorial change, but it marked a turning point in modern mechanized warfare. The Battles of the Isonzo. Although Italy had been formally allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary, it remained neutral in August 1914. Tensions within the alliance had long existed because Italy claimed parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire as its own. To persuade Italy to join their side, the Entente promised extensive territorial gains at Austria-Hungary's expense. On May 23, 1915, Italy declared war on Austria-Hungary, and in August 1916 it also declared war on Germany. This opened a new southern front, threatening the weakened Austro-Hungarian Empire. The border region along the Isonzo River became the main theater of war in southern Europe. Between June 1915 and October 1917, there were 12 major battles fought there. Warfare in the high mountains brought unique dangers. Avalanches, extreme cold, and rock slides caused by explosions were constant threats to the soldiers. Despite material superiority, the Italians failed to advance across the Isonzo toward Slovenia and Austria. The front soon stagnated, stretching for hundreds of kilometers from the Adriatic coast across the Karst Plateau to the Alpine heights of Tyrol. The difficult terrain made warfare extremely hard. Moving men, weapons, ammunition, and supplies to the front demanded immense logistical and physical effort. As in the West, the war in southern Europe became a war of attrition fought in confined spaces with heavy artillery. During the first 5 Isonzo battles, the Italians tried to cross the river and push toward Trieste, but despite massive losses on both sides, they achieved no meaningful breakthrough. When the Central Powers had to divert troops from the southern front to counter the Brusilov offensive in August 1916, the Italians managed to capture Gorizia, Gers, in the 6th Battle of the Isonzo after an intense artillery bombardment. However, they lacked the reserves needed for a decisive breakthrough. During the following battles in 1916, Italy made only small territorial gains. In the 10th Battle of the Isonzo, May 1917, with 36 divisions, the Italians achieved significant territorial advances, only to lose them again under Austro-Hungarian counterattacks. In the 11th Battle of the Isonzo, Italy launched its largest offensive yet. 48 divisions and 6,800 guns attacked along a 70-kilometer front, aiming for a final breakthrough to Trieste. Though the numerically inferior Austro-Hungarian troops barely managed to prevent the collapse, their front was close to breaking. The 12th Battle of the Isonzo, however, brought a dramatic reversal. Supported by a German army, the Austro-Hungarians launched a counteroffensive in late October 1917, breaking through the Italian lines and advancing to the Piave River within 2 weeks. The breakthrough to the Piave, 1917. After 11 costly Isonzo battles, the Austro-Hungarian front in northern Italy was on the brink of collapse by autumn 1917. Emperor Karl I of Austria appealed to Germany for military assistance. Due to the relative calm on the Western Front and the October Revolution in Russia, the German Supreme Army Command, OHL, was able to send 7 divisions to reinforce the front. On October 24, 1917, the Central Powers launched their attack from Tolmin, now Tolmin, Slovenia. Over 3,300 guns opened fire in a massive bombardment that left the Italian artillery unable to respond effectively. After 8 hours of shelling, the Central Powers troops stormed forward, achieving a 27-kilometer advance by evening and capturing around 15,000 Italian soldiers. In the following days, the Italian front completely collapsed. Massive numbers of Italian soldiers were taken prisoner, while many others deserted or fled in panic. Even newly arrived reserve units dissolved in the face of the rapid advance. On October 28th, German and Austro-Hungarian troops recaptured Gorizia, Gers, and 2 days later, they took Udine. Only at the Piave River were the Italians able, with British and French reinforcements, to regroup and establish a new defensive line, preventing the Central Powers from advancing into the Po Valley. Within 2 weeks, the Central Powers had advanced about 150 kilometers into Italian territory, destroying 2 Italian armies. Nearly 300,000 Italian soldiers were captured, and a similar number fled. The disintegration of the Italian army and the potential collapse of Italy's alliance with the Entente was only prevented by the rapid arrival of French and British support. By early November 1917, the advance of the Central Powers came to a halt at the Piave. Facing the threat of further occupation, Italy mobilized all remaining strength for the war. A propaganda poster for the 5th Italian War Loan, 1918, appealed to the people for liberation, showing an Alpine soldier with an axe fending off an enemy's grasp across the Piave, symbolizing the defense of the homeland. With Allied support, newly reorganized Italian forces launched a successful counter-offensive in October 1918, defeating the weakened and collapsing Austro-Hungarian army and forcing its capitulation. Italy thus emerged among the victorious powers of the First World War, though many Italians later called it a mutilated victory, since the Allies failed to deliver all the territorial gains they had promised. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, 1918. The war dramatically intensified Russia's political and social problems. As the conflict dragged on and casualties mounted, unrest and protests increased, culminating in the February Revolution of 1917, which forced the Tsar to abdicate. The new provisional government, a coalition of liberal politicians, shared power with socialist workers and soldiers' councils, Soviets. It decided to continue the war alongside Russia's allies. However, after successful offensives by the Central Powers in the summer of 1917, the Russian front collapsed over a width of 200 kilometers, forcing Russian units to retreat more than 100 kilometers back to the Sareth River. The Central Powers thus regained almost all of eastern Galicia and Bukovina. Signs of the disintegration of the Russian army became clear. Mass desertions and uprisings made any effective defense impossible. The provisional government lost public support, and ongoing supply shortages fueled revolutionary sentiment. The October Revolution brought Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik followers to power. In December 1917, Russia withdrew from the war, and even before that, fraternization between Russian and German soldiers was already taking place along the front. Following the revolution, Lenin's Bolshevik government pushed for peace to stabilize Russia internally. After a public peace offer on November 28, 1917, German Chancellor Georg Graf von Hertling declared Germany's willingness to negotiate. Peace talks began on December 3 in Brest-Litovsk, now Brest, Belarus, leading to a ceasefire signed on December 15, 1917. Germany's Supreme Army Command, OHL, saw the truce in the East as an opportunity to focus on victory in the West. Lenin's call for inviting the Western allies to general peace talks in Brest-Litovsk was rejected by the Germans. The official negotiations began on January 8, 1918, with Richard von Kuhlmann, 1873 to 1948, heading the German delegation, and Leon Trotsky leading the Russian one. Under pressure from the OHL, Kuhlmann demanded German annexation and control over large occupied territories, including Poland, the Baltic states, and Courland. Trotsky tried to stall for time, hoping revolutionary unrest would erupt within the Central Powers. After Germany presented its demands, he returned to Petrograd, today St. Petersburg, and negotiations were postponed to January 20, 1918. In the meantime, German troops occupied additional Russian territory. While talks with the Bolsheviks stalled, Germany also negotiated a separate peace with Ukraine, agreeing to recognize Ukrainian independence in exchange for large grain deliveries to the German Empire. This so-called bread peace was signed on February 9th, increasing pressure on the Bolsheviks. A day later, Trotsky declared Russia's withdrawal from the war, but broke off peace negotiations without signing a treaty. In response, the OHL ordered a renewed offensive on February 19, 1918, advancing rapidly into Russian territory. Faced with military collapse, the Bolsheviks capitulated and accepted the German terms. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed on March 3, 1918, forced Russia to recognize a series of German-controlled satellite states stretching from Ukraine to the Baltic. Russia lost over half of its industrial capacity and nearly one-third of its population, being pushed far eastward. The treaty was later annulled by the Treaty of Versailles and Somme in 1919. The Russian Revolution. When the Russian Empire entered World War I in 1914 alongside Britain and France, it was already burdened with deep social, economic, and political tensions. Public support for the Tsar quickly eroded as military defeats, poor supply conditions, and economic hardship worsened. By 1917, these problems erupted into two revolutions and later a devastating civil war. The February Revolution, the fall of the Tsar. Widespread war weariness, food shortages in the cities, and general discontent were major causes of the February Revolution. Most crucial, however, was the collapse of confidence in Tsar Nicholas II. The Duma, parliament, blamed the Tsar personally for Russia's failures and demanded reforms. Even the monarchist elite turned against him, symbolized by the murder of Grigory Rasputin, a monk whose influence over the royal family had become scandalous. In early 1917, workers at the Putilov factories in Petrograd went on strike. On February 23rd, women took to the streets demanding bread, soon joined by the striking workers. The demonstrations spread rapidly, with protesters waving red flags, symbols of revolution. When the army refused to fire on civilians and defected to the rebels, the regime collapsed. On March 2nd, March 15th, New Style, Nicholas II abdicated, ending more than 300 years of Romanov rule and the Russian monarchy. A provisional government took power, granting civil liberties, issuing political amnesties, and abolishing discrimination based on religion, nationality, or class. A constituent assembly was to decide Russia's future political system. However, by continuing the war and postponing land reform, the provisional government quickly lost popular support. The resulting chaos and unrest played into the hands of Lenin's Bolsheviks, who dominated the Soviets, councils of workers and soldiers that represented the discontented masses. Upon Lenin's return from exile in April 1917, his promises of peace, land, and all power to the Soviets won him growing support. The October Revolution, the Bolsheviks seize power. On the night of October 24th to 25th, the Red Guards and pro-Bolshevik army units seized key government buildings and communication centers in Petrograd. By the next night, they had arrested members of the provisional government and proclaimed a socialist Soviet republic. Lenin had pushed for an armed uprising despite internal opposition from party members who favored a legal, peaceful transition of power. His determination and persuasive authority led the Bolshevik Central Committee to approve the armed takeover. While Petrograd fell with little resistance, Moscow witnessed heavy fighting, with several hundred casualties. The revolution spread gradually to the rest of Russia, especially beyond the major cities. The new workers' and peasants' government immediately withdrew from the war and redistributed land to the peasants. In a wave of decrees, the Bolsheviks dismantled the old state. Banks were nationalized, factories placed under workers' control, military and noble ranks abolished, and church and state separated. They proclaimed equality and self-determination for the peoples of the Russian Empire. At the same time, they banned the press, dissolved the old army, and created the Cheka, Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, which arrested and persecuted political opponents. The Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, RSFSR, was established, providing a constitutional framework for the new Soviet order. The Civil War, the struggle for Russia. Although the Bolsheviks had seized power in October 1917, they still had to defend it against other political groups and large parts of the population. This led to the Russian Civil War, a brutal conflict that engulfed the entire country. Lenin and the Bolsheviks relied on the newly created Red Army to defend their regime. Their enemies, the so-called Whites, were a loose coalition of monarchists, liberals, and anti-communists led mainly by former imperial generals. They were supported by foreign intervention forces from Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, as well as elements of the Czechoslovak Legion, which had become stranded in Russia after the revolution. Other groups pursued their own interests. Social revolutionaries, peasants, Cossacks, and Kronstadt sailors fought independently. Meanwhile, German advances following the Brest-Litovsk negotiations created yet another front. Numerous non-Russian peoples, including Poles, Finns, and Baltic nations, fought for and achieved independence. The chaos was so extensive that many regions changed hands multiple times. Despite the combined strength of these anti-Bolshevik forces, the Bolsheviks ultimately prevailed, though at enormous cost. The Civil War claimed an estimated 8 to 10 million lives, far more than Russia's losses in World War I. The economy was devastated, and by 1921 to 1922, the country suffered a catastrophic famine. The revolutionary period that began in 1917 finally ended with the founding of the Soviet Union on December 31, 1922. The German Spring Offensive, 1918. Following the successful breakthrough to the Piave River in Italy and the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Russia, the German Supreme Army Command, OHL, sought in spring 1918 to achieve final victory in the West with a decisive large-scale offensive. By concentrating all available forces on the Western Front, the Central Powers gained, for the first time in 4 years, a numerical superiority over the Allies. The German advance began on March 21, 1918, under the code name Michael, along a 70-kilometer front between Arras and La Fère, with a total of 71 divisions. The strategic objective was the capture of Amiens and the separation of British and French forces. However, the attempt to take Amiens failed. The OHL soon launched another offensive beginning on April 9, hoping to achieve a decisive victory by capturing the Kemmel Ridge. The overwhelming superiority of German artillery enabled the infantry to advance rapidly through the first enemy lines, achieving breakthroughs up to 50 kilometers deep in some areas. Even Paris came under long-range artillery fire. Yet, after about a week, the offensive stalled due to exhaustion and supply difficulties. A second attack launched on April 6th between La Fère and the Oise-Eisen Canal was halted by Allied counterattacks. Although the Germans had pushed the Allied lines back significantly, capturing about 90,000 prisoners and 1,200 guns, the assault on Amiens failed. The most advanced German troops were forced to stop 17 kilometers short of the city. After the major offensive in Picardy bogged down despite initial success, General Erich Ludendorff sought to revive momentum with a second attack. This operation, codenamed Georgette, assembled 29 divisions, over 2,200 artillery pieces, and roughly 500 aircraft. On April 9, 1918, German forces renewed their advance between Armentières and La Bassée, targeting the northern flank held by British and smaller Portuguese units. The goal was to cut off these troops from the Allied southern front. The Germans pushed the British and Portuguese back to the Lys River, but failed to drive them to the Channel ports. While the Fourth Army gained significant ground northwest of the Lys, the Sixth Army captured Armentières on April 11, 1918. 2 weeks later, German forces stormed the long-contested Kemmel Ridge near Ypres, heightening Allied fears of another German breakthrough. However, the expanding front severely strained German supply lines. When British resistance stiffened after the arrival of French reinforcements, the German offensive petered out following one last push toward Amiens. All plans for a further advance were temporarily abandoned. To improve conditions for the next attack, the Germans launched another offensive on May 27, 1918, targeting the southern front between Soissons and Reims, where French troops defended the Chemin des Dames Ridge. The objective was to force the French to withdraw divisions from the north and redeploy them south. For this operation, the OHL assembled 38 divisions with over 5,200 guns, opposed by 21 French divisions with about 1,400 guns. After a massive artillery and gas bombardment, German infantry successfully captured the Chemin des Dames. The rapid German victory on this previously well-defended ridge shocked the French. Their retreating front between Reims and Compiègne opened a path for the Germans to advance toward Paris. On May 29th, the Germans captured Soissons, and a day later, they reached the Marne River between Dormans and Château-Thierry, their closest position to Paris since the Battle of the Marne in 1914. Panic spread through the French capital, and the government evacuated Paris. Nevertheless, Allied Commander-in-Chief Ferdinand Foch remained confident that the German offensive would soon lose momentum. He refused to withdraw troops from Flanders. Indeed, the physical exhaustion of German soldiers, severe supply shortages, and the failure of artillery to keep pace with the advancing infantry brought the offensive to a halt. Although the Germans achieved substantial territorial gains and captured vast quantities of war material, their hopes for a decisive victory once again collapsed. The Battle of Amiens, 1918. Around the same time as the German spring offensive of 1918, a propaganda poster for Germany's Eighth War Loan appeared. Following the victory in the East, it urged the population to summon all remaining strength and deliver a final blow to achieve victory on the Western Front as well. Indeed, in spring 1918, German armies succeeded for the first time since 1914 in breaking the deadlock and making significant territorial gains. However, the enthusiasm stirred by propaganda soon turned to disappointment when the offensive collapsed in the summer of 1918. German soldiers were exhausted, malnourished, and demoralized after years of fighting. The offensives of 1918 had caused enormous losses, and few experienced soldiers still believed in victory. When the Allied counteroffensives began near Villers, Ampie, Cotteret, and Amiens, the German army's retreat commenced. For the first time, large numbers of German soldiers surrendered, even though the front did not collapse completely and the army continued to fight while retreating. However, it was now the Entente powers who delivered the real final blow against the German forces. The Allies launched their offensive at Villers-Cotterêts on July 18, 1918, successfully spearheaded by tank assaults. German units were driven back from the Marne, though their organized withdrawal prevented an immediate Allied breakthrough. At Amiens, beginning on August 8, 1918, 35 Allied divisions attacked the German front. The 20 British divisions deployed 360 heavy Mark V Star tanks and 96 light Whippet tanks, capable of reaching speeds of over 12 kilometers per hour. The 15 French divisions fielded about 90 tanks and had clear air superiority with roughly 1,000 combat aircraft. Supported by American reinforcements, the Allies' combined assault struck deep into the German lines. The battle revealed that German morale had collapsed. Exhausted and demoralized, thousands of soldiers surrendered. Many others fell victim to the Spanish flu, which had been devastating armies on all sides since spring 1918. After the catastrophic defeat at Amiens, the Supreme Army Command, OHL, concluded that the war could no longer be won militarily. On September 29, 1918, General Erich Ludendorff informed the German government that the military situation was hopeless and demanded immediate armistice negotiations based on U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, as well as the rapid transformation of Germany into a parliamentary system. The War in German Southwest Africa, 1914 to 1915. When war broke out in Europe in August 1914, it quickly escalated into a global conflict involving the European great powers. On August 5, 1914, Britain ordered attacks on German possessions in the Pacific, Asia, and Africa, including Togoland, Cameroon, German East Africa, and German Southwest Africa. In German Southwest Africa, about 5,000 men of the colonial Schutztruppe protection force, reinforced by reservists and volunteers under Lieutenant Colonel Joachim von Heidebreck, 1861 to 1914, engaged South African Union troops in combat starting in September 1914. The British Dominion of South Africa, acting on London's orders, sought to quickly seize German naval bases and advance north to occupy the colony. By January 1915, South African forces had captured the key coastal towns Luderitz Bay and Swakopmund, securing vital supply routes in the largely undeveloped colony. In the north, along the border with Portuguese Angola, fighting between German and Portuguese troops continued from autumn 1914 into February 1915. The Germans, moving primarily on horses, camels, and donkey carts, were heavily outnumbered and outgunned by over 50,000 well-equipped South African troops. After Heidebreck's death in November 1914, command passed to Lieutenant Colonel Victor Franke, 1866 to 1936, who began a gradual retreat northward in March 1915, occasionally engaging in skirmishes. South African forces occupied Karabib on May 5, 1915, without resistance, and took Windhoek 9 days later after it had been abandoned by Governor Theodore Seitz, 1863 to 1949. Facing a hopeless situation, Seitz and Franke surrendered on July 9, 1915, at Otavi. The fighting had cost over 1,300 German lives and about 250 South African. The War in German East Africa. Serving as adjutant to General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, Walter von Ruckteschell, 1882 to 1941, participated in the East African Campaign and later depicted his wartime experiences in artwork showing German and African machine gun crews. Although the Berlin Conference of 1885 had declared Central and East Africa a neutral free trade zone in case of European wars, British forces attacked German East Africa in 1914, turning the region into another front. All sides relied heavily on African porters, hundreds of thousands of whom were forcibly conscripted from their villages. Many died from exhaustion, disease, or were shot while attempting to escape. The war devastated entire regions, causing famine and epidemics that killed up to 500,000 people by 1918. German settlers, officials, and employees in East Africa were mobilized into the Schutztruppe under Lettow-Vorbeck's command. Of its roughly 15,000 men, the majority were African Askari soldiers, highly respected by their German officers for their discipline and fighting spirit. Lettow Vorbeck aimed to tie down as many Allied forces as possible in colonial warfare to relieve pressure on Germany's European fronts. However, the Allies' naval and logistical superiority prevented the Germans from launching major offensives. In November 1914, around 8,000 British and Indian troops attempted a landing at Tanga, but were repelled by Lettow Vorbeck's forces in a surprise victory that shocked the Allies and delayed further British attacks. By April 1916, the British, under General John Smuts, 1870 to 1950, launched a new campaign with tens of thousands of troops from Britain, India, and South Africa. Smuts's forces invaded northern German East Africa, driving the Germans south from Mount Kilimanjaro, seizing the central railway from Dar es Salaam to Mpapua, and capturing Dar es Salaam in September 1916. Belgian troops advanced from the Congo into the northwest, while additional British forces pushed in from northern Rhodesia. Facing a tenfold numerical disadvantage, Lettow Vorbeck avoided pitched battles, waging a guerrilla war in the southern jungles. Through forced marches and hit-and-run attacks, his forces held out until November 1917, before retreating into Portuguese Mozambique. In 1918, Lettow Vorbeck launched a small counteroffensive in southern East Africa, achieving minor gains. The final engagement occurred in early November 1918 near Kasanga and Lake Rukwa. When news of the armistice in Europe reached him, Lettow Vorbeck surrendered on November 25, 1918. He was later celebrated in Germany as the only undefeated German general of World War I. On March 2, 1919, he returned to Berlin with the remnants of his Schutztruppe to a hero's welcome. However, Lettow Vorbeck's brutal campaign, waged for over 4 years and devastating to local populations, was romanticized in Germany. His actions were portrayed as heroic and disciplined, fostering a myth of loyal African comrades, the Askari myth, that persisted for decades. In the Weimar Republic and under the Nazi regime, this myth became a central element of colonial propaganda. The image of the faithful Askari fighting alongside Germans served as alleged proof of the beneficial nature of German colonial rule. Many Germans believed the story unquestioningly, convinced that Africans longed for the return of German rule. For former colonists and nationalist circles, the Askari myth provided a sense of pride and justification after the loss of Germany's colonies under the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Armistice negotiations. After the Allied breakthrough at the Battle of Amiens in August 1918, the German Supreme Army Command, OHL, saw no further possibility of winning the war. The collapse of Germany's Allied powers was becoming increasingly evident. On September 14th, Austro-Hungarian Emperor Karl I sent a peace note to all belligerent nations, and shortly thereafter Bulgaria began talks with the Entente, concluding an armistice on September 29th. Faced with continuing Allied offensives on the Western Front, Erich Ludendorff urged the immediate German request for an armistice based on U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. As a precondition to facilitate negotiations, Ludendorff demanded the parliamentarization of the German Empire and the formation of a new government. On October 3rd, Prince Max of Baden was appointed Reich Chancellor. A day later, Germany sent its armistice proposal to Wilson via Switzerland. In his reply on October 8th, Wilson first demanded the evacuation of all occupied territories as a prerequisite for further talks, to which the German government agreed on October 12th. In his second note, Wilson accused Germany of repeated violations of international law and insisted on the immediate end of unrestricted submarine warfare. The German government complied. Nevertheless, in his third note on October 23rd, Wilson demanded a comprehensive democratization of Germany and a restriction of power for princes and the military. He also insisted that the armistice terms must make any renewed German military action impossible. The OHL sought to resist and continue fighting, but could not prevail against the civilian government. After Ludendorff's dismissal, the way was cleared for Germany's fourth note to Wilson, requesting specific armistice terms. Wilson's positive reply on November 5th allowed for the dispatch of a German delegation, which 6 days later signed the Armistice of Compiègne. The Armistice of Compiègne, aus Itchen-Bani, 1918. Due to the hopeless situation on the Western Front and the collapse of Bulgaria, the OHL on September 29, 1918, demanded the immediate initiation of armistice negotiations. After weeks of preliminary talks between the new German government under Prince Max of Baden and President Woodrow Wilson, and following the adoption of parliamentary reforms in Germany, the armistice negotiations began on November 8, 1918, near Compiègne, north of Paris. On the morning of November 11, 1918, Matthias Erzberger, for Germany, and Marshal Ferdinand Foch, for the Allies, signed the armistice in a railway station carriage in the forest of Compiègne. It came into effect the same day. At 11 a.m., trumpets signaled the end of hostilities, and soon after, the guns fell silent. A contemporary satirical medal depicted Uncle Sam, the USA, and John Bull in Britain, tying up the fallen German Michel, while Marshal Foch, recognizable by his French képi, stood above them as the one giving orders. As supreme commander of the Allied forces in France and Belgium, Foch had led the Entente to victory over Germany. Germany had sent its first armistice offer to Wilson on October 4th via Switzerland, based on his 14 points. In his reply of October 8th, Wilson demanded the withdrawal from all occupied territories as a precondition for further talks, and Germany agreed on October 12th. In his second note, Wilson accused Germany of multiple breaches of international law and demanded an immediate end to submarine warfare. Germany complied, but in his third note on October 23rd, Wilson again insisted on full parliamentarization and the curtailment of the prince's and military's power. He also required armistice terms that would make it impossible for Germany to resume hostilities. The OHL wanted to reject these terms and continue fighting, but the civilian government overruled them. Ludendorff's dismissal opened the way for Germany's fourth message to Wilson, requesting detailed conditions. Wilson's positive response on November 5th allowed for a German delegation to be sent. In agreement with the German government, the OHL sent a primarily civilian delegation headed by State Secretary Matthias Erzberger. As Erzberger had proposed on November 7th, the delegation included only one representative each from the Army and Navy. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, head of the OHL, pragmatically saw an advantage in this arrangement. In public, the responsibility for Germany's defeat could thus be shifted from the military to the politicians. Erzberger's room for negotiation in France was extremely limited. Ferdinand Foch made it clear that the German delegation was there to accept the dictated terms, not to negotiate them. He categorically refused to discuss any conditions that might allow Germany to continue the war. The armistice terms amounted to an unconditional surrender, withdrawal of German troops from occupied territories in France and Belgium, as well as from Alsace-Lorraine, occupation of the left bank of the Rhine by Allied forces, annulment of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Russia, surrender of weapons, locomotives, railway cars, and trucks, transfer of submarines, battle cruisers, and destroyers to Allied ports. On November 11, 1918, Erzberger and Foch signed the Armistice of Compiègne. In Germany, its terms were widely regarded as harsh and humiliating, shocking a population that had not expected such a total defeat. Not only the far right viewed the armistice as a disgrace to the German Empire, a sentiment also reflected in the satirical medal, symbolizing the humiliation felt across much of the country.